Chapter 1 of At the Villa Rose. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nicholas Clifford. At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. Chapter 1. Summer Lightning. It was Mr. Ricardo's habit, as soon as the second week of August came round, to travel to Aix-les-Bains in Savoy, where for 5 or 6 weeks he lived pleasantly. He pretended to take the waters in the morning, he went for a ride in his motor car in the afternoon, he dined at the Cercle in the evening, and spent an hour or two afterwards in the baccarat rooms at the Villa des Fleurs. An enviable, smooth life without a doubt, and it is certain that his acquaintances envied him. At the same time, however, they laughed at him, and, alas, with some justice, for he was an exaggerated person. He was to be construed in the comparative. Everything in his life was a trifle overdone, from the fastidious arrangement of his neckties to the feminine nicety of his little dinner parties. In age, Mr. Ricardo was approaching the 50s. In condition, he was a widower, a state greatly to his liking, for he avoided at once the irksomeness of marriage and the reproaches justly levelled at the bachelor. Finally, he was rich, having amassed a fortune in Mincing Lane, which he had invested in profitable securities. 10 years of ease, however, had not altogether obliterated in him the business outlook. Though he lounged from January to December, he lounged with the air of a financier taking a holiday, and when he visited, as he frequently did, the studio of a painter, a stranger would have hesitated to decide whether he had been drawn thither by a love of art or by the possibility of an investment. His acquaintances have been mentioned, and the word is suitable, for while he mingled in many circles, he stood aloof from them all. He affected the company of artists, by whom he was regarded as one ambitious to become a connoisseur, and amongst the younger business men who had never dealt with him, he earned the disrespect reserved for the dilettante. If he had a grief, it was that he had discovered no great man who, in return for practical favours, would engrave his memory in brass. He was a Maecenas without a Horace, an Earl of Southampton without a Shakespeare. In a word, Aix-les-Bains in the season was the very place for him, and never for a moment did it occur to him that he was here to be dipped in agitations and hurried from excitement to excitement. The beauty of the little town, the crowd of well-dressed and agreeable people, the rose-coloured life of the place, all made their appeal to him. But it was the Villa des Fleurs which brought him to Aix. Not that he played for anything more than an occasional louis, nor, on the other hand, was he merely a cold looker-on. He had a banknote or two in his pocket on most evenings at the service of the victims of the tables. But the pleasure to his curious and dilettante mind lay in the spectacle of the battle which was waged night after night between raw nature and good manners. It was extraordinary to him how constantly manners prevailed. There were, however, exceptions. For instance, on the first evening of this particular visit, he found the rooms hot and sauntered out into the little semicircular garden at the back. He sat there for half an hour under a flawless sky of stars, watching the people come and go in the light of the electric lamps, and appreciating the gowns and jewels of the women with the eye of a connoisseur. And then, into this starlit quiet, there came suddenly a flash of vivid life. A girl in a soft, clinging frock of white satin darted swiftly from the rooms and flung herself nervously upon a bench. She could not, to Ricardo's thinking, be more than 20 years of age. She was certainly quite young. The supple slenderness of her figure proved it, and he had moreover caught a glimpse, as she rushed out, of a fresh and very pretty face, but he had lost sight of it now. For the girl wore a big black satin hat with a broad brim, from which a couple of white ostrich feathers curved over at the back, and in the shadow of that hat her face was masked. All that he could see was a pair of long diamond eardrops, which sparkled and trembled as she moved her head, and that she did constantly. Now she stared moodily at the ground, now she flung herself back, then she twisted nervously to the right, and then a moment afterwards to the left, and then again she stared in front of her, swinging a satin slipper backwards and forwards against the pavement with the petulance of a child. All her movements were spasmodic. She was on the verge of hysteria. Ricardo was expecting her to burst into tears when she sprang up, and as swiftly as she had come, she hurried back into the rooms. Summer lightning, thought Mr. Ricardo. Near to him a woman sneered, and a man said pityingly, "She was pretty, that little one. It is regrettable that she has lost." A few minutes afterwards Ricardo finished his cigar and strolled back into the rooms, making his way to the big table just on the right hand of the entrance, where the play as a rule runs high. It was clearly running high tonight, for so deep a crowd thronged about the table that Ricardo could only by standing on tiptoe see the faces of the players. Of the banker he could not catch a glimpse. But though the crowd remained, its units were constantly changing, and it was not long before Ricardo found himself standing in the front rank of the spectators, just behind the players seated in the chairs. The oval green table was spread out beneath him, littered with banknotes. Ricardo turned his eyes to the left and saw seated at the middle of the table the man who was holding the bank. Ricardo recognized him with a start of surprise. He was a young Englishman, Harry Wethermill, who after a brilliant career at Oxford and at Munich had so turned his scientific genius to account that he had made a fortune for himself at the age of 28. He sat at the table with the indifferent look of the habitual player upon his cleanly chiseled face. But it was plain that his good fortune stayed at his elbow tonight, for opposite to him the croupier was arranging with extraordinary deftness piles of banknotes in the order of their value. The bank was winning heavily. Even as Ricardo looked, Wethermill turned up a natural, and the croupier swept in the stakes from either side. "Faites vos jeux, messieurs, le jeu est fait," the croupier cried, all in a breath, and repeated the words. Wethermill waited with his hand upon the wooden frame in which the cards were stacked. He glanced around the table while the stakes were being laid upon the cloth, and suddenly his face flashed from languor into interest. Almost opposite to him a small white-gloved hand holding a 5-louis note was thrust forward between the shoulders of two men seated at the table. Wethermill leaned forward and shook his head with a smile. With a gesture he refused the stake. But he was too late. The fingers of the hand had opened. The note fluttered down onto the cloth. The money was staked. At once he leaned back in his chair. "Il y a une suite," he said quietly. He relinquished the bank rather than play against that 5-louis note. The stakes were taken up by their owners. The croupier began to count Wethermill's winnings, and Ricardo, curious to know whose small, delicately gloved hand it was which had brought the game to so abrupt a termination, leaned forward. He recognized the young girl in the white satin dress and the big black hat, whose nerves had got the better of her a few minutes since in the garden. He saw her now clearly, and thought her of an entrancing loveliness. She was moderately tall, fair of skin, with a fresh colouring upon her cheeks which she owed to nothing but her youth. Her hair was of a light brown with a sheen upon it, her forehead broad, her eyes dark and wonderfully clear. But there was something more than her beauty to attract him. He had a strong belief that somewhere, some while ago, he had already seen her, and this belief grew and haunted him. He was still vaguely puzzling his brains to fix the place when the croupier finished the reckoning. "There are 2,000 louis in the bank," he cried. "Who will take on the bank for 2,000 louis?" No one, however, was willing. A fresh bank was put up for sale, and Wethermill, still sitting in the dealer's chair, bought it. He spoke at once to an attendant, and the man slipped round the table and, forcing his way through the crowd, carried a message to the girl in the black hat. She looked towards Wethermill and smiled, and the smile made her face a miracle of tenderness. Then she disappeared, and in a few moments Ricardo saw a way open in the throng behind the banker, and she appeared again only a yard or two away, just behind Wethermill. He turned, and taking her hand into his, shook it chidingly. "I couldn't let you play against me, Celia," he said in English. "My luck's too good tonight. So you shall be my partner instead. I'll put in the capital, and we'll share the winnings." The girl's face flushed rosily. Her hand still lay clasped in his. She made no effort to withdraw it. "I couldn't do that," she exclaimed. "Why not?" said he. "See?" And loosening her fingers, he took from them the 5 louis note and tossed it over to the croupier to be added to his bank. "Now you can't help yourself. We're partners." The girl laughed, and the company at the table smiled, half in sympathy, half with amusement. A chair was brought for her, and she sat down behind Wethermill, her lips parted, her face joyous with excitement. But all at once Wethermill's luck deserted him. He renewed his bank 3 times, and had lost the greater part of his winnings when he had dealt the cards through. He took a 4th bank, and rose from that too a loser. "That's enough, Celia," he said. "Let us go out into the garden. It will be cooler there." "I have taken your good luck away," said the girl remorsefully. Wethermill put his arm through hers. "You'll have to take yourself away before you can do that," he answered, and the couple walked together out of Ricardo's hearing. Ricardo was left to wonder about Celia. She was just one of those problems which made Aix-les-Bains so unfailingly attractive to him. She dwelt in some street of Bohemia, so much was clear. The frankness of her pleasure, of her excitement, and even of her distress proved it. She passed from one to the other while you could deal a pack of cards. She was at no pains to wear a mask. Moreover, she was a young girl of 19 or 20, running about those rooms alone, as unembarrassed as if she had been at home. There was the free use, too, of Christian names. Certainly she dwelt in Bohemia. But it seemed to Ricardo that she could pass in any company, and yet not be overpassed. She would look a little more picturesque than most girls of her age, and she was certainly a good deal more soignée than many, and she had the Frenchwoman's knack of putting on her clothes. But those would be all the differences, leaving out the frankness. Ricardo wondered in what street of Bohemia she dwelt. He wondered still more when he saw her again half an hour afterwards at the entrance to the Villa des Fleurs. She came down the long hall with Harry Wethermill at her side. The couple were walking slowly and talking, as they walked with so complete an absorption in each other that they were unaware of their surroundings. At the bottom of the steps a stout woman of 55, over-jewelled and overdressed, and raddled with paint, watched their approach with a smile of good-humoured amusement. When they came near enough to hear, she said in French, "Well, Célie, are you ready to go home?" The girl looked up with a start. "Of course, madame," she said with a certain submissiveness which surprised Ricardo. "I hope I have not kept you waiting?" She ran to the cloak-room and came back again with her cloak. "Good-bye, Harry," she said, dwelling upon his name and looking out upon him with soft and smiling eyes. "I shall see you to-morrow evening," he said, holding her hand. Again she let it stay within his keeping, but she frowned, and a sudden gravity settled like a cloud upon her face. She turned to the elder woman with a sort of appeal. "No, I do not think we shall be here to-morrow, shall we, madame?" she said reluctantly. "Of course not," said madame briskly. "You have not forgotten what we have planned? No, we shall not be here to-morrow, but the night after, yes." Celia turned back again to Wethermill. "Yes, we have plans for to-morrow," she said, with a very wistful note of regret in her voice, and seeing that madame was already at the door, she bent forward and said timidly, "But the night after I shall want you." "I shall thank you for wanting me," Wethermill rejoined, and the girl tore her hand away and ran up the steps. Harry Wethermill returned to the rooms. Mr. Ricardo did not follow him. He was too busy with the little problem which had been presented to him that night. What could that girl, he asked himself, have in common with the raddled woman she addressed so respectfully? Indeed, there had been a note of more than respect in her voice. There had been something of affection. Again Mr. Ricardo found himself wondering in what street in Bohemia Celia dwelt, and as he walked up to the hotel there came yet another question to amuse him. Why, he asked, could neither Celia nor Madame come to the Villa des Fleurs to-morrow night? What are the plans they have made? And what was it in those plans which had brought this sudden gravity and reluctance into Celia's face? Ricardo had reason to remember those questions during the next few days, though he only idled with them now. End of chapter 1. Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 2. A Cry for Help. It was on a Monday evening that Ricardo saw Harry Wethermill and the girl Celia together. On the Tuesday he saw Wethermill in the rooms alone and had some talk with him. Wethermill was not playing that night, and at about 10 o'clock the two men left the Villa des Fleurs together. "Which way do you go?" asked Wethermill. "Up the hill to the Hotel Majestic," said Ricardo. "We go together, then. I, too, am staying there," said the young man, and they climbed the steep streets together. Ricardo was dying to put some questions about Wethermill's young friend of the night before, but discretion kept him reluctantly silent. They chatted for a few moments in the hall upon indifferent topics, and so separated for the night. Mr. Ricardo, however, was to learn something more of Celia the next morning, for while he was fixing his tie before the mirror, Wethermill burst into his dressing-room. Mr. Ricardo forgot his curiosity in the surge of his indignation. Such an invasion was an unprecedented outrage upon the gentle tenor of his life. The business of the morning toilette was sacred. To interrupt it carried a subtle suggestion of anarchy. Where was his valet? Where was Charles, who should have guarded the door like the custodian of a chapel? "I cannot speak to you for at least another half-hour," said Mr. Ricardo sternly. But Harry Wethermill was out of breath and shaking with agitation. "I can't wait," he cried with a passionate appeal. "I have got to see you. You must help me, Mr. Ricardo. You must indeed." Ricardo spun round upon his heel. At first he had thought that the help wanted was the help usually wanted at Aix-les-Bains. A glance at Wethermill's face, however, and the ringing note of anguish in his voice told him that the thought was wrong. Mr. Ricardo slipped out of his affectations as out of a loose coat. "What has happened?" he asked quietly. "Something terrible." With shaking fingers Wethermill held out a newspaper. "Read it," he said. It was a special edition of a local newspaper, the Journal de Savoie, and it bore the date of that morning. "They are crying it in the streets," said Wethermill. "Read." A short paragraph was printed in large black letters on the first page and leaped to the eyes. "Late last night," it ran, "an appalling murder was committed at the Villa Rose on the road to Lac Bourget. Madame Camille Dauvray, an elderly, rich woman who was well known at Aix and had occupied the villa every summer for the last few years, was discovered on the floor of her salon, fully dressed and brutally strangled, while upstairs her maid, Hélène Vauquier, was found in bed, chloroformed, with her hands tied securely behind her back. At the time of going to press she had not recovered consciousness, but the doctor, Émile Pétain, is in attendance upon her, and it is hoped that she will be able shortly to throw some light on this dastardly affair. The police are properly reticent as to the details of the crime, but the following statement may be accepted without hesitation. The murder was discovered at 12 o'clock at night by the sergent de ville Perrichet, to whose intelligence more than a word of praise is due, and it is obvious from the absence of all marks upon the door and windows that the murderer was admitted from within the villa. Meanwhile, Madame Dauvray's motor car has disappeared, and with it a young Englishwoman who came to Aix with her as her companion. The motive of the crime leaps to the eyes. Madame Dauvray was famous in Aix for her jewels, which she wore with too little prudence. The condition of the house shows that a careful search was made for them, and they have disappeared. It is anticipated that a description of the young Englishwoman, with a reward for her apprehension, will be issued immediately. And it is not too much to hope that the citizens of Aix, and indeed of France, will be cleared of all participation in so cruel and sinister a crime. Ricardo read through the paragraph with a growing consternation and laid the paper upon his dressing-table. "It is infamous!" cried Wethermill passionately. "The young Englishwoman is, I suppose, your friend Miss Celia?" said Ricardo slowly. Wethermill started forward. "You know her, then?" he cried in amazement. "No, but I saw her with you in the rooms. I heard you call her by that name." "You saw us together!" exclaimed Wethermill. "Then you can understand how infamous the suggestion is." But Ricardo had seen the girl half an hour before he had seen her with Harry Wethermill. He could not but vividly remember the picture of her as she flung herself onto the bench in the garden in a moment of hysteria and petulantly kicked a satin slipper backwards and forwards against the stones. She was young, she was pretty, she had a charm of freshness, but, strive against it as he would, this picture in the recollection began more and more to wear a sinister aspect. He remembered some words spoken by a stranger. "She is pretty, that little one. It is regrettable that she has lost." Mr. Ricardo arranged his tie with even a greater deliberation than he usually employed. "And Madame Dauvray?" he asked. "She was the stout woman with whom your young friend went away?" "Yes," said Wethermill. Ricardo turned round from the mirror. "What do you want me to do?" "Hanaud is at Aix. He is the cleverest of the French detectives. You know him. He dined with you once." It was Mr. Ricardo's practice to collect celebrities round his dinner table, and at one such gathering Hanaud and Wethermill had been present together. "You wish me to approach him?" "At once." "It is a delicate position," said Ricardo. "Here is a man in charge of a case of murder, and we are quietly to go to him—" To his relief, Wethermill interrupted him. "No, no," he cried. "He is not in charge of the case. He is on his holiday. I read of his arrival 2 days ago in the newspaper. It was stated that he came for rest. What I want is that he should take charge of the case." The superb confidence of Wethermill shook Mr. Ricardo for a moment, but his recollections were too clear. "You are going out of your way to launch the acutest of French detectives in search of this girl? Are you wise, Wethermill?" Wethermill sprang up from his chair in desperation. "You, too, think her guilty. You have seen her. You think her guilty, like this detestable newspaper, like the police." "Like the police?" asked Ricardo sharply. "Yes," said Harry Wethermill sullenly. "As soon as I saw that rag I ran down to the villa. The police are in possession. They would not let me into the garden, but I talked with one of them. They, too, think that she let in the murderers." Ricardo took a turn across the room. Then he came to a stop in front of Wethermill. "Listen to me," he said solemnly. "I saw this girl half an hour before I saw you. She rushed out into the garden. She flung herself onto a bench. She could not sit still. She was hysterical. You know what that means. She had been losing. That's point number 1. Mr. Ricardo ticked it off upon his finger. "She ran back into the rooms. You asked her to share the winnings of your bank. She consented eagerly, and you lost. That's point number 2. A little later, as she was going away, you asked her whether she would be in the rooms the next night, yesterday night, the night when the murder was committed. Her face clouded over. She hesitated. She became more than grave. There was a distinct impression as though she shrank from the contemplation of what it was proposed she should do on the next night. And then she answered you, 'No, we have other plans.' That's number 3." And Mr. Ricardo ticked off his 3rd point. "Now," he asked, "do you still ask me to launch Hanaud upon the case?" "Yes, and at once," cried Wethermill. Ricardo called for his hat and his stick. "You know where Hanaud is staying?" he asked. "Yes," replied Wethermill, and he led Ricardo to an unpretentious little hotel in the centre of the town. Ricardo sent in his name, and the 2 visitors were immediately shown into a small sitting-room where Monsieur Hanaud was enjoying his morning chocolate. He was stout and broad-shouldered, with a full and almost heavy face. In his morning suit at his breakfast table he looked like a prosperous comedian. He came forward with a smile of welcome, extending both his hands to Mr. Ricardo. "Ah, my good friend," he said, "it is pleasant to see you. And Mr. Wethermill," he exclaimed, holding out a hand to the young inventor. "You remember me, then?" said Wethermill gladly. "It is my profession to remember people," said Hanaud with a laugh. "You were at that amusing dinner party of Mr. Ricardo's in Grosvenor Square." "Monsieur," said Wethermill, "I have come to ask your help." The note of appeal in his voice was loud. Monsieur Hanaud drew up a chair by the window and motioned to Wethermill to take it. He pointed to another with a bow of invitation to Mr. Ricardo. "Let me hear," he said gravely. "It is the murder of Madame Dauvray," said Wethermill. Hanaud started. "And in what way, monsieur," he asked, "are you interested in the murder of Madame Dauvray?" "Her companion," said Wethermill. "The young English girl. She is a great friend of mine." Hanaud's face grew stern. Then came a sparkle of anger in his eyes. "And what do you wish me to do, monsieur?" he asked coldly. "You are upon your holiday, Monsieur Hanaud. I wish you, no, I implore you," Wethermill cried, his voice ringing with passion, "to take up this case, to discover the truth, to find out what has become of Celia." Hanaud leaned back in his chair with his hands upon the arms. He did not take his eyes from Harry Wethermill, but the anger died out of them. "Monsieur," he said, "I do not know what your procedure is in England, but in France a detective does not take up a case or leave it alone according to his pleasure. We are only servants. This affair is in the hands of Monsieur Fleuriot, the juge d'instruction of Aix." "But if you offered him your help it would be welcomed," cried Wethermill. "And to me that would mean so much. There would be no bungling, there would be no waste of time. Of that one would be sure." Hanaud shook his head gently. His eyes were softened now by a look of pity. Suddenly he stretched out a forefinger. "You have perhaps a photograph of the young lady in that card case in your breast pocket." Wethermill flushed red, and drawing out the card case handed the portrait to Hanaud. Hanaud looked at it carefully for a few moments. "It was taken lately, here?" he asked. "Yes, for me," replied Wethermill quietly. "And it is a good likeness?" "Very." "How long have you known this Mademoiselle Celie?" he asked. Wethermill looked at Hanaud with a certain defiance. "For a fortnight." Hanaud raised his eyebrows. "You met her here?" "Yes." "In the rooms, I suppose, not at the house of one of your friends?" "That is so," said Wethermill quietly. "A friend of mine who had met her in Paris introduced me to her at my request." Hanaud handed back the portrait and drew forward his chair nearer to Wethermill. His face had grown friendly. He spoke with a tone of respect. "Monsieur, I know something of you. Our friend, Mr. Ricardo, told me your history. I asked him for it when I saw you at his dinner. You are one of those about whom one does ask questions, and I know that you are not a romantic boy, but who shall say that he is safe from the appeal of beauty? I have seen women, monsieur, for whose purity of soul I would myself have stood security, condemned for complicity in brutal crimes on evidence that could not be gainsaid, and I have known them turn foul-mouthed and hideous to look upon the moment after their just sentence has been pronounced." "No doubt, monsieur," said Wethermill with perfect quietude, "but Celia Harland is not one of those women." "I do not now say that she is," said Hanaud, "but the juge d'instruction here has already sent me to ask for my assistance, and I refused. I replied that I was just a good bourgeois enjoying his holiday. Still, it is difficult quite to forget one's profession. It was the commissaire of police who came to me, and naturally I talked with him for a little while. The case is dark, monsieur, I warn you." Wethermill nodded his head sullenly. Ricardo drew his chair up towards the others. But Hanaud was not at that moment interested in Ricardo. "Well, then, let us see who there are in Madame Dauvray's household. The list is not a long one. It was Madame Dauvray's habit to take her luncheon and her dinner at the restaurants, and her maid was all that she required to get ready her petit déjeuner in the morning and her sirop at night. Let us take the members of the household one by one. There is first the chauffeur, Henri Servetat. He was not at the villa last night. He came back to it early this morning." "Ah!" said Ricardo in a significant exclamation. Wethermill did not stir. He sat still as a stone, with a face as deadly white, and eyes burning on Hanaud's face. "But wait," said Hanaud, holding up a warning hand to Ricardo. "Servetat was in Chambéry, where his parents live. He travelled to Chambéry by the 2 o'clock train yesterday. He was with them in the afternoon. He went with them to a café in the evening. Moreover, early this morning the maid, Hélène Vauquier, was able to speak a few words in answer to a question. She said Servetat was in Chambéry. She gave his address. A telephone message was sent to the police in that town, and Servetat was found in bed. I do not say that it is impossible that Servettaz was concerned in the crime, but it is quite clear, I think, that it was not he who opened the house to the murderers, for he was at Chambéry in the evening, and the murder was already discovered here by midnight. Moreover, it is a small point, he lives, not in the house, but over the garage in a corner of the garden. Then besides the chauffeur there was a charwoman, a woman of Aix, who came each morning at 7 and left in the evening at 7 or 8. Sometimes she would stay later if the maid was alone in the house, for the maid is nervous. But she left last night before 9, there is evidence of that, and the murder did not take place until afterwards. That is also a fact, not a conjecture. We can leave the charwoman, who for the rest has the best of characters, out of our calculations. There remain then the maid, Hélène Vauquier, and, he shrugged his shoulders, Mademoiselle Célie. Hanaud reached out for the matches and lit a cigarette. Let us take first the maid, Hélène Vauquier, 40 years old, a Normandy peasant woman. They are not bad people, the Normandy peasants, monsieur. Avaricious, no doubt, but on the whole honest and most respectable. We know something of Hélène Vauquier, monsieur. See." And he took up a sheet of paper from the table. The paper was folded lengthwise, written upon only on the inside. "I have some details here. Our police system is, I think, a little more complete than yours in England. Hélène Vauquier has served Madame Dauvray for 7 years. She has been the confidential friend rather than the maid. And mark this, Mr. Wethermill, during those 7 years how many opportunities has she had of conniving at last night's crime? She was found chloroformed and bound. There is no doubt that she was chloroformed. Upon that point Dr. Pétain is quite certain. He saw her before she recovered consciousness. She was violently sick on awakening. She sank again into unconsciousness. She is only now in a natural sleep. Besides those people, there is Mademoiselle Célie. Of her, monsieur, nothing is known. You yourself know nothing of her. She comes suddenly to Aix as the companion of Madame Dauvray, a young and pretty English girl. How did she become the companion of Madame Dauvray?" Wethermill stirred uneasily in his seat. His face flushed. To Mr. Ricardo that had been from the beginning the most interesting problem of the case. Was he to have the answer now? "I do not know," answered Wethermill with some hesitation, and then it seemed that he was at once ashamed of his hesitation. His accent gathered strength, and in a low but ringing voice he added, "But I say this. You have told me, Monsieur Hanaud, of women who looked innocent and were guilty, but you know also of women and girls who can live untainted and unspoilt amidst surroundings which are suspicious." Hanaud listened, but he neither agreed nor denied. He took up a second slip of paper. "I shall tell you something now of Madame Dauvray," he said. "We will not take up her early history. It might not be edifying, and, poor woman, she is dead. Let us not go back beyond her marriage 17 years ago to a wealthy manufacturer of Nancy whom she met in Paris. 7 years ago Monsieur Dauvray died, leaving his widow a very rich woman. She had a passion for jewellery, which she was now able to gratify. She collected jewels. A famous necklace, a well-known stone. She was not, as you say, happy till she got it. She had a fortune in precious stones. Oh, but a large fortune. By the ostentation of her jewels she paraded her wealth here at Monte Carlo, in Paris. Besides that, she was kind-hearted and most impressionable. Finally, she was, like so many of her class, superstitious to the degree of folly." Suddenly Mr. Ricardo started in his chair. Superstitious! The word was a sudden light upon his darkness. Now he knew what had perplexed him during the last 2 days. Clearly, too clearly, he remembered where he had seen Celia Harland, and when. A picture rose before his eyes, and it seemed to strengthen like a film in a developing dish, as Hanaud continued. "Very well, take Madame Dauvray as we find her, rich, ostentatious, easily taken by a new face, generous and foolishly superstitious, and you have in her a living provocation to every rogue. By 100 instances she proclaimed herself a dupe. She threw down a challenge to every criminal to come and rob her. For 7 years Hélène Vauquier stands at her elbow and protects her from serious trouble. Suddenly there is added to her your young friend, and she is robbed and murdered. And, follow this, Mr. Wethermill, our thieves are, I think, more brutal to their victims than is the case with you." Wethermill shut his eyes in a spasm of pain, and the pallor of his face increased. "Suppose that Celia were one of the victims," he cried in a stifled voice. Hanaud glanced at him with a look of commiseration. "That perhaps we shall see," he said. "But what I meant was this. A stranger like Mademoiselle Celie might be the accomplice in such a crime as the crime of the Villa Rose, meaning only robbery. A stranger might only have discovered too late that murder would be added to the theft." Meanwhile, in strong, clear colours, Ricardo's picture stood out before his eyes. He was startled by hearing Wethermill say in a firm voice, "My friend Ricardo has something to add to what you have said." "I?" exclaimed Ricardo. How in the world could Wethermill know of that clear picture in his mind? "Yes, you saw Celia Harland on the evening before the murder." Ricardo stared at his friend. It seemed to him that Harry Wethermill had gone out of his mind. Here he was corroborating the suspicions of the police by facts, damning and incontrovertible facts. "On the night before the murder," continued Wethermill quietly, "Celia Harland lost money at the baccarat table. Ricardo saw her in the garden behind the rooms, and she was hysterical. Later on that same night he saw her again with me, and he heard what she said. I asked her to come to the rooms on the next evening, yesterday, the night of the crime, and her face changed, and she said, 'No, we have other plans for tomorrow, but the night after I shall want you.'" Hanaud sprang from his chair. "And you tell me these two things?" he cried. "Yes," said Wethermill. "You were kind enough to say to me I was not a romantic boy. I am not. I can face facts." Hanaud stared at his companion for a few moments. Then, with a remarkable air of consideration, he bowed. "You have won, monsieur," he said. "I will take up this case. But," and his face grew stern, and he brought his fist down upon the table with a bang, "I shall follow it to the end now, be the consequences bitter as death to you." "That is what I wish, monsieur," said Wethermill. Hanaud locked up the slips of paper in his letter case. Then he went out of the room and returned in a few minutes. "We will begin at the beginning," he said briskly. "I have telephoned to the depot. Perrichet, the sergent de ville who discovered the crime, will be here at once. We will walk down to the villa with him, and on the way he shall tell us exactly what he discovered and how he discovered it. At the villa we shall find Monsieur Fleuriot, the juge d'instruction, who has already begun his examination, and the commissaire of police. In company with them we will inspect the villa. Except for the removal of Madame Dauvray's body from the salon to her bedroom and the opening of the windows, the house remains exactly as it was." "We may come with you?" cried Harry Wethermill eagerly. "Yes, on one condition, that you ask no questions and answer none unless I put them to you. Listen, watch, examine, but no interruptions." Hanaud's manner had altogether changed. It was now authoritative and alert. He turned to Ricardo. "You will swear to what you saw in the garden and to the words you heard?" he asked. "They are important." "Yes," said Ricardo. But he kept silence about that clear picture in his mind, which seemed to him no less important, no less suggestive. The Assembly Hall at Leamington, a crowded audience chiefly of ladies, a platform at one end on which a black cabinet stood. A man, erect and with something of the soldier in his bearing, led forward a girl, pretty and fair-haired, who wore a black velvet dress with a long sweeping train. She moved like one in a dream. Some half-dozen people from the audience climbed onto the platform, tied the girl's hands with tape behind her back, and sealed the tape. She was led to the cabinet, and in full view of the audience, fastened to a bench. Then the door of the cabinet was closed. The people upon the platform descended into the body of the hall, and the lights were turned very low. The audience sat in suspense, and then abruptly in the silence and the darkness there came the rattle of a tambourine from the empty platform. rappings and knockings seemed to flicker round the panels of the hall, and in the place where the door of the cabinet should be, there appeared a splash of misty whiteness. The whiteness shaped itself dimly into the figure of a woman. A face dark and eastern became visible, and a deep voice spoke in a chant of the Nile and Antony. Then the vision faded, the tambourines and the cymbals rattled again, the lights were turned up, the door of the cabinet thrown open, and the girl in the black velvet dress was seen fastened upon the bench within. It was a spiritualistic performance at which Julius Ricardo had been present 2 years ago. The young, fair-haired girl in black velvet, the medium, was Celia Harland. That was the picture which was in Ricardo's mind, and Hanaud's description of Madame d'Auvray made a terrible commentary upon it. Easily taken in by a new face, generous and foolishly superstitious, a living provocation to every rogue. Those were the words, and here was a beautiful girl of 20, versed in those very tricks of imposture which would make Madame d'Auvray her natural prey. Ricardo looked at Wethermill, doubtful whether he should tell what he knew of Celia Harland or not, but before he had decided, a knock came upon the door. "Here is Perrichet," said Hanaud, taking up his hat. "We will go down to the Villa Rose." End of chapter 2. Of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3. Perrichet's Story. Perrichet was a young, thick-set man with a red, fair face and a moustache and hair so pale in colour that they were almost silver. He came into the room with an air of importance. "Aha," said Hanaud with a malicious smile. "You went to bed late last night, my friend, yet you were up early enough to read the newspaper. Well, I am to have the honour of being associated with you in this case." Perrichet twirled his cap awkwardly and blushed. "Monsieur is pleased to laugh at me," he said, "but it was not I who called myself intelligent, though indeed I would like to be so, for the good God knows I do not look it." Hanaud clapped him on the shoulder. "Then congratulate yourself. It is a great advantage to be intelligent and not to look it. We shall get on famously. Come." The four men descended the stairs, and as they walked towards the villa, Perrichet related, concisely and clearly, his experience of the night. "I passed the gate of the villa about 9:30, he said. "The gate was closed. Above the wall and bushes of the garden I saw a bright light in the room upon the first floor, which faces the road at the southwestern corner of the villa. The lower windows I could not see. More than an hour afterwards I came back, and as I passed the villa again I noticed that there was now no light in the room upon the first floor, but that the gate was open. I thereupon went into the garden, and pulling the gate, let it swing to and latch. But it occurred to me as I did so that there might be visitors at the villa who had not yet left, and for whom the gate had been set open. I accordingly followed the drive which winds round to the front door. The front door is not on the side of the villa which faces the road, but at the back. When I came to the open space where the carriages turn, I saw that the house was in complete darkness. There were wooden lattice doors to the long windows on the ground floor, and these were closed. I tried one to make certain, and found the fastening secure. The other windows upon that floor were shuttered. No light gleamed anywhere. I then left the garden, closing the gate behind me. I heard a clock strike the hour a few minutes afterwards, so that I can be sure of the time. It was now 11 o'clock. I came round a third time an hour after, and to my astonishment I found the gate once more open. I had left it closed, and the house shut up and dark. Now it stood open. I looked up to the windows, and I saw that in a room on the second floor, close beneath the roof, a light was burning brightly. That room had been dark an hour before. I stood and watched the light for a few minutes, thinking that I should see it go out. But it did not. It burned quite steadily. This light, and the gate opened and reopened, aroused my suspicions. I went again into the garden, but this time with greater caution. It was a clear night, and although there was no moon, I could see without the aid of my lantern. I stole quietly along the drive. When I came round to the front door, I noticed immediately that the shutters of one of the ground floor windows were swung back, and that the inside glass window which descended to the ground stood open. The sight gave me a shock. Within the house those shutters had been opened. I felt the blood turn to ice in my veins, and a chill crept along my spine. I thought of that solitary light burning steadily under the roof. I was convinced that something terrible had happened. "Yes, yes, quite so," said Hanaud. "Go on, my friend." "The interior of the room gaped black," Perrichet resumed. "I crept up to the window at the side of the wall and dashed my lantern into the room. The window, however, was in a recess which opened into the room through an arch, and at each side of the arch curtains were draped. The curtains were not closed, but between them I could see nothing but a strip of the room. I stepped carefully in, taking heed not to walk on the patch of grass before the window. The light of my lantern showed me a chair overturned upon the floor, and to my right, below the middle one of the three windows in the right-hand side wall, a woman lying huddled on the floor. It was Madame Dauvray. She was dressed. There was a little mud upon her shoes, as though she had walked after the rain had ceased. Monsieur will remember that 2 heavy showers fell last evening, between 6 and 8. "Yes," said Hanaud, nodding his approval. She was quite dead. Her face was terribly swollen and black, and a piece of thin, strong cord was knotted so tightly about her neck and had sunk so deeply into her flesh that at first I did not see it, for Madame Dauvray was stout. "Then what did you do?" asked Hanaud. "I went to the telephone which was in the hall and rang up the police. Then I crept upstairs very cautiously, trying the doors. I came upon no one until I reached the room under the roof where the light was burning. There I found Hélène Vauquier, the maid, snoring in bed in a terrible fashion." The 4 men turned a bend in the road. A few paces away a knot of people stood before a gate which a sergent de ville guarded. "But here we are at the villa," said Hanaud. They all looked up, and from a window at the corner upon the first floor a man looked out and drew in his head. "That is Monsieur Besnard, the commissaire of our police in Aix," said Perrichet. "And the window from which he looked," said Hanaud, "must be the window of that room in which you saw the bright light at 9:30 on your first round?" "Yes, monsieur," said Perrichet. "That is the window." They stopped at the gate. Perrichet spoke to the sergent de ville, who at once held the gate open. The party passed into the garden of the villa. End of chapter 3. Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. At the Villa. The drive curved between trees and high bushes towards the back of the house, and as the party advanced along it a small, trim, soldier-like man with a pointed beard came to meet them. It was the man who had looked out from the window, Louis Besnard, the commissaire of police. "You are coming then to help us, Monsieur Hanaud," he cried, extending his hands. "You will find no jealousy here, no spirit amongst us of anything but goodwill, no desire except one to carry out your suggestions. All we wish is that the murderers should be discovered. Mon Dieu, what a crime! And so young a girl to be involved in it. But what will you?" "So you have already made up your mind on that point?" said Hanaud sharply. The commissaire shrugged his shoulders. "Examine the villa, and then judge for yourself whether any other explanation is conceivable," he said, and turning, he waved his hand towards the house. Then he cried, "Ah!" and drew himself into an attitude of attention. A tall, thin man of about 45 years, dressed in a frock coat and a high silk hat, had just come round an angle of the drive and was moving slowly towards them. He wore the soft, curling brown beard of one who has never used a razor on his chin, and had a narrow face with eyes of a very light grey and a round, bulging forehead. "This is the juge d'instruction?" asked Hanaud. "Yes, Monsieur Fleuriot," replied Louis Besnard in a whisper. Monsieur Fleuriot was occupied with his own thoughts, and it was not until Besnard stepped forward noisily on the gravel that he became aware of the group in the garden. "This is Monsieur Hanaud of the Sûreté in Paris," said Louis Besnard. Monsieur Fleuriot bowed with cordiality. "You are very welcome, Monsieur Hanaud. You will find that nothing at the villa has been disturbed. The moment the message arrived over the telephone that you were willing to assist us, I gave instructions that all should be left as we found it. I trust that you, with your experience, will see a way where our eyes find none." Hanaud bowed in reply. "I shall do my best, Monsieur Fleuriot. I can say no more," he said. "But who are these gentlemen?" asked Fleuriot, waking, it seemed now for the first time, to the presence of Harry Wethermill and Mr. Ricardo. "They are both friends of mine," replied Hanaud. "If you do not object, I think their assistance may be useful. Mr. Wethermill, for instance, was acquainted with Celia Harland." "Ah!" cried the judge, and his face took on suddenly a keen and eager look. "You can tell me about her, perhaps?" "All that I know I will tell readily," said Harry Wethermill. Into the light eyes of Monsieur Fleuriot there came a cold, bright gleam. He took a step forward. His face seemed to narrow to a greater sharpness. In a moment, to Mr. Ricardo's thought, he ceased to be the judge. He dropped from his high office. He dwindled into a fanatic. "She is a Jewess, this Celia Harland," he cried. "No, Monsieur Fleuriot, she is not," replied Wethermill. "I do not speak in disparagement of that race, for I count many friends amongst its members. But Celia Harland is not one of them." "Ah!" said Fleuriot, and there was something of disappointment, something too of incredulity in his voice. "Well, you will come and report to me when you have made your investigation." And he passed on without another question or remark. The group of men watched him go, and it was not until he was out of earshot that Besnard turned with a deprecating gesture to Hanaud. "Yes, he is a good judge, Monsieur Hanaud, quick, discriminating, sympathetic, but he has that bee in his bonnet like so many others. Everywhere he must see l'affaire Dreyfus. He cannot get it out of his head. No matter how insignificant a woman is murdered, she must have letters in her possession which would convict Dreyfus. But you know, there are thousands like that, good, kindly, just people, in the ordinary ways of life, but behind every crime they see the Jew." Hanaud nodded his head. "I know, and in a juge d'instruction it is very embarrassing. Let us walk on." Halfway between the gate and the villa a second carriage road struck off to the left, and at the entrance to it stood a young, stout man in black leggings. "The chauffeur?" asked Hanaud. "I will speak to him." The commissaire called the chauffeur forward. "Servetat," he said, "you will answer any questions which monsieur may put to you." "Certainly, monsieur le commissaire," said the chauffeur. His manner was serious, but he answered readily. There was no sign of fear upon his face. "How long have you been with Madame Dauvray?" Hanaud asked. 4 months, monsieur. I drove her to Aix from Paris." "And since your parents live at Chambéry, you wish to seize the opportunity of spending a day with them while you were so near?" "Yes, monsieur." "When did you ask for permission?" "On Saturday, monsieur." "Did you ask particularly that you should have yesterday, the Tuesday?" "No, monsieur. I asked only for a day, whenever it should be convenient to madame." "Quite so," said Hanaud. "Now, when did Madame Dauvray tell you that you might have Tuesday?" Servetat hesitated. His face became troubled. When he spoke reluctantly. "It was not Madame Dauvray, monsieur, who told me that I might go on Tuesday," he said. "Not Madame Dauvray? Who was it, then?" Hanaud asked sharply. Servetat glanced from one to another of the grave faces which confronted him. "It was Mademoiselle Celie," he said, "who told me." "Oh," said Hanaud slowly. "It was Mademoiselle Celie. When did she tell you?" "On Monday morning, monsieur. I was cleaning the car. She came to the garage with some flowers in her hand, which she had been cutting in the garden, and she said, 'I was right, Alphonse. Madame has a kind heart. You can go tomorrow by the train which leaves Aix at 1:52 and arrives at Chambéry at 9 minutes after 2. Hanaud started. "I was right, Alphonse. Were those her words? And Madame has a kind heart? Come, come, what is all this?" He lifted a warning finger and said gravely, Be very careful, Servetat. Those were her words, monsieur. I was right, Alphonse. Madame has a kind heart? Yes, monsieur. Then Mademoiselle Celie had spoken to you before about this visit of yours to Chambéry? Said Hanaud, with his eyes fixed steadily upon the chauffeur's face. The distress upon Servetat's face increased. Suddenly Hanaud's voice rang sharply. You hesitate. Begin at the beginning. Speak the truth, Servetat. Monsieur, I am speaking the truth, said the chauffeur. It is true I hesitate. I have heard this morning what people are saying. I do not know what to think. Mademoiselle Celie was always kind and thoughtful for me. But it is true, and with a kind of desperation he went on, yes, it is true that it was Mademoiselle Celie who first suggested to me that I should ask for a day to go to Chambéry. When did she suggest it? On the Saturday. To Mr. Ricardo the words were startling. He glanced with pity towards Wethermill. Wethermill, however, had made up his mind for good and all. He stood with a dogged look upon his face, his chin thrust forward, his eyes upon the chauffeur. Besnard, the commissaire, had made up his mind too. He merely shrugged his shoulders. Hanaud stepped forward and laid his hand gently on the chauffeur's arm. Come, my friend, he said, let us hear exactly how this happened. Mademoiselle Celie, said Servetat, with genuine compunction in his voice, came to the garage on Saturday morning and ordered the car for the afternoon. She stayed and talked to me for a little while, as she often did. She said that she had been told that my parents lived at Chambéry, and since I was so near I ought to ask for a holiday, for it would not be kind if I did not go and see them. That was all? Yes, monsieur. Very well. And the detective resumed at once his brisk voice and alert manner. He seemed to dismiss Servetat's admission from his mind. Ricardo had the impression of a man tying up an important document, which for the moment he has done with, and putting it away ticketed in some pigeon-hole in his desk. Let us see the garage. They followed the road between the bushes until a turn showed them the garage with its doors open. The doors were found unlocked? Just as you see them. Hanaud nodded. He spoke again to Servetat. What did you do with the key on Tuesday? I gave it to Hélène Vauquier, monsieur, after I had locked up the garage, and she hung it on a nail in the kitchen. I see, said Hanaud. So anyone could easily have found it last night. Yes, monsieur, if one knew where to look for it. At the back of the garage a row of petrol tins stood against the brick wall. Was any petrol taken? Asked Hanaud. Yes, monsieur. There was very little petrol in the car when I went away. More was taken, but it was taken from the middle tins. These. And he touched the tins. I see, said Hanaud, and he raised his eyebrows thoughtfully. The commissaire moved with impatience. From the middle or from the end? What does it matter? He exclaimed. The petrol was taken. Hanaud, however, did not dismiss the point so lightly. But it is very possible that it does matter, he said gently. For example, if Servetat had had no reason to examine his tins, it might have been some while before he found out that the petrol had been taken. Indeed, yes, said Servetat. I might even have forgotten that I had not used it myself. Quite so, said Hanaud, and he turned to Besnard. I think that may be important. I do not know, he said. But since the car is gone, cried Besnard, how could the chauffeur not look immediately at his tins? The question had occurred to Ricardo, and he wondered in what way Hanaud meant to answer it. Hanaud, however, did not mean to answer it. He took little notice of it at all. He put it aside with a superb indifference to the opinion which his companion might form of him. Ah, yes, he said carelessly. Since the car is gone, as you say, that is so. And he turned again to Servetat. It was a powerful car? He asked. 60 horsepower, said Servetat. Hanaud turned to the commissaire. You have the number and description, I suppose? It will be as well to advertise for it. It may have been seen. It must be somewhere. The commissaire replied that the description had already been printed, and Hanaud, with a nod of approval, examined the ground. In front of the garage there was a small stone courtyard, but on its surface there was no trace of a footstep. "Yet the gravel was wet," he said, shaking his head. "The man who fetched that car fetched it carefully." He turned and walked back with his eyes upon the ground. Then he ran to the grass border between the gravel and the bushes. "Look," he said to Wethermill. "A foot has pressed the blades of grass down here, but very lightly. Yes, and there again. Someone ran along the border here on his toes. Yes, he was very careful." They turned again into the main drive, and following it for a few yards, came suddenly upon a space in front of the villa. It was a small toy pleasure house, looking onto a green lawn gay with flower beds. It was built of yellow stone, and was almost square in shape. A couple of ornate pillars flanked the door, and a gable roof, topped by a gilt vane, surmounted it. To Ricardo it seemed impossible that so sordid and sinister a tragedy had taken place within its walls during the last 12 hours. It glistened so gaudily in the blaze of sunlight. Here and there the green outer shutters were closed. Here and there the windows stood open to let in the air and light. Upon each side of the door there was a window lighting the hall, which was large. Beyond those windows again on each side there were glass doors opening to the ground, and protected by the ordinary green latticed shutters of wood, which now stood hooked back against the wall. These glass doors opened into rooms oblong in shape, which ran through towards the back of the house, and were lighted in addition by side windows. The room upon the extreme left, as the party faced the villa, was the dining room, with the kitchen at the back. The room on the right was the salon, in which the murder had been committed. In front of the glass door to this room, a strip of what had once been grass stretched to the gravel drive. But the grass had been worn away by constant use, and the black mould showed through. This strip was about 3 yards wide, and as they approached they saw, even at a distance, that since the rain of last night it had been trampled down. "We will go round the house first," said Hanaud, and he turned along the side of the villa and walked in the direction of the road. There were 4 windows just above his head, of which 3 lighted the salon, and the 4th a small writing room behind it. Under these windows there was no disturbance of the ground, and a careful investigation showed conclusively that the only entrance used had been the glass doors of the salon facing the drive. To that spot, then, they returned. There were 3 sets of footmarks upon the soil. One set ran in a distinct curve from the drive to the side of the door, and did not cross the others. "Those," said Hanaud, "are the footsteps of my intelligent friend Perrichet, who was careful not to disturb the ground." Perrichet beamed all over his rosy face, and Besnard nodded at him with condescending approval. "But I wish, Monsieur le Commissaire," and Hanaud pointed to a blur of marks, "that your other officers had been as intelligent. Look, these run from the glass door to the drive, and for all the use they are to us, a harrow might have been dragged across them." Besnard drew himself up. "Not one of my officers has entered the room by way of this door. The strictest orders were given and obeyed. The ground as you see it is the ground as it was at 12 o'clock last night." Hanaud's face grew thoughtful. "Is that so?" he said, and he stooped to examine the second set of marks. They were at the right-hand side of the door. "A woman and a man," he said. "But they are mere hints rather than prints. One might almost think—" He rose up without finishing his sentence, and he turned to the third set, and a look of satisfaction gleamed upon his face. "Ah, here is something more interesting," he said. There were just 3 impressions, and whereas the blurred marks were at the side, these 3 pointed straight from the middle of the glass doors to the drive. They were quite clearly defined, and all 3 were the impressions made by a woman's small, arched, high-heeled shoe. The position of the marks was at first sight a little peculiar. There was one a good yard from the window, the impression of the right foot, and the pressure of the sole of the shoe was more marked than that of the heel. The second, the impression of the left foot, was not quite so far from the first as the first was from the window, and here again the heel was the more lightly defined. But there was this difference. The mark of the toe, which was pointed in the first instance, was, in this, broader and a trifle blurred. Close beside it the right foot was again visible, only now the narrow heel was more clearly defined than the ball of the foot. It had indeed sunk half an inch into the soft ground. There were no further imprints. Indeed, these two were not merely close together. They were close to the gravel of the drive and on the very border of the grass. Hanaud looked at the marks thoughtfully. Then he turned to the commissaire. "Are there any shoes in the house which fit those marks?" "Yes, we have tried the shoes of all the women. Célie Harland, the maid, and even Madame Dauvray. The only ones which fit at all are those taken from Célie Harland's bedroom." He called to an officer standing in the drive, and a pair of grey suede shoes were brought to him from the hall. "See, Monsieur Hanaud, it is a pretty little foot which made these clear impressions," he said, with a smile. "A foot arched and slender. Madame Dauvray's foot is short and square, the maid's broad and flat. Neither Madame Dauvray nor Hélène Vauquier could have worn these shoes. They were lying, one here, one there, upon the floor of Célie Harland's room, as though she had kicked them off in a hurry. They are almost new, you see. They have been worn once, perhaps, no more, and they fit with absolute precision into these footmarks, except just at the toe of that second one." Hanaud took the shoes and, kneeling down, placed them one after the other over the impressions. To Ricardo it was extraordinary how exactly they covered up the marks and filled the indentations. "I should say," said the commissaire, "that Célie Harland went away wearing a new pair of shoes made on the very same last as those." As those she had left carelessly lying on the floor of her room for the first person to notice, thought Ricardo. It seemed as if the girl had gone out of her way to make the weight of evidence against her as heavy as possible. Yet, after all, it was just through inattention to the small details, so insignificant at the red moment of crime, so terribly instructive the next day, that guilt was generally brought home. Hanaud rose to his feet and handed the shoes back to the officer. "Yes," he said, "so it seems. The shoemaker can help us here. I see the shoes were made in Aix." Besnard looked at the name stamped in gold letters upon the lining of the shoes. "I will have inquiries made," he said. Hanaud nodded, took a measure from his pocket, and measured the ground between the window and the first footstep, and between the first footstep and the other two. "How tall is Mademoiselle Célie?" he asked, and he addressed the question to Wethermill. It struck Ricardo as one of the strangest details in all this strange affair that the detective should ask with confidence for information which might help to bring Celia Harland to the guillotine from the man who had staked his happiness upon her innocence. "About 5'7", he answered. Hanaud replaced his measure in his pocket. He turned with a grave face to Wethermill. "I warned you fairly, didn't I?" he said. Wethermill's white face twitched. "Yes," he said, "I am not afraid." But there was more of anxiety in his voice than there had been before. Hanaud pointed solemnly to the ground. "Read the story those footprints write in the mould there. A young and active girl of about Mademoiselle Célie's height, and wearing a new pair of Mademoiselle Célie's shoes, springs from that room where the murder was committed, where the body of the murdered woman lies. She is running. She is wearing a long gown. At the second step the hem of the gown catches beneath the point of her shoe. She stumbles. To save herself from falling, she brings up the other foot sharply and stamps the heel down into the ground. She recovers her balance. She steps onto the drive. It is true the gravel here is hard and takes no mark, but you will see that some of the mould which has clung to her shoes has dropped off. She mounts into the motor car with the man and the other woman and drives off sometime between 11 and 12. "Between 11 and 12? Is that sure?" asked Besnard. "Certainly," replied Hanaud. "The gate is open at 11 and Perrichet closes it. It is open again at 12. Therefore the murderers had not gone before 11. No, the gate was open for them to go, but they had not gone. Else why should the gate again be open at midnight?" Besnard nodded in assent, and suddenly Perrichet started forward, with his eyes full of horror. "Then, when I first closed the gate," he cried, "and came into the garden and up to the house, they were there, in that room. Oh, my God!" He stared at the window with his mouth open. "I am afraid, my friend, that it is so," said Hanaud gravely. "But I knocked upon the wooden door. I tried the bolts, and they were within, in the darkness within, holding their breath not 3 yards from me." He stood transfixed. "That we shall see," said Hanaud. He stepped in Perrichet's footsteps to the sill of the room. He examined the green wooden doors which opened outwards, and the glass doors which opened inwards, taking a magnifying glass from his pocket. He called Besnard to his side. "See," he said, pointing to the woodwork. "Finger marks?" asked Besnard eagerly. "Yes, of hands in gloves," returned Hanaud. "We shall learn nothing from these marks except that the assassins knew their trade." Then he stooped down to the sill where some traces of steps were visible. He rose with a gesture of resignation. "Rubber shoes," he said, and so stepped into the room, followed by Wethermill and the others. They found themselves in a small recess which was panelled with wood painted white, and here and there delicately carved into festoons of flowers. The recess ended in an arch, supported by 2 slender pillars, and on the inner side of the arch thick curtains of pink silk were hung. These were drawn back carelessly, and through the opening between them the party looked down the length of the room beyond. They passed within. End of chapter 4. Of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. In the Salon. Julius Ricardo pushed aside the curtains with a thrill of excitement. He found himself standing within a small oblong room which was prettily, even daintily furnished. On his left, close by the recess, was a small fireplace with the ashes of a burnt-out fire in the grate. Beyond the grate, a long settee covered in pink damask, with a crumpled cushion at each end, stood a foot or 2 away from the wall, and beyond the settee the door of the room opened into the hall. At the end a long mirror was let into the panelling, and a writing table stood by the mirror. On the right were the 3 windows, and between the 2 nearest to Mr. Ricardo was the switch of the electric light. A chandelier hung from the ceiling. An electric lamp stood upon the writing table, a couple of electric candles on the mantel-shelf. A round satin-wood table stood under the windows, with 3 chairs about it, of which one was overturned, one was placed with its back to the electric switch, and the third on the opposite side facing it. Ricardo could hardly believe that he stood actually upon the spot where, within 12 hours, a cruel and sinister tragedy had taken place. There was so little disorder. The 3 windows on his right showed him the blue sunlit sky and a glimpse of flowers and trees. Behind him the glass door stood open to the lawn, where birds piped cheerfully and the trees murmured of summer. But he saw Hanaud stepping quickly from place to place, with an extraordinary lightness of step for so big a man, obviously engrossed, obviously reading here and there some detail, some custom of the inhabitants of that room. Ricardo leaned with careful artistry against the wall. "Now, what has this room to say to me?" he asked importantly. Nobody paid the slightest attention to his question, and it was just as well, for the room had very little information to give him. He ran his eye over the white Louis XVI furniture, the white panels of the wall, the polished floor, the pink curtains. Even the delicate tracery of the ceiling did not escape his scrutiny. Yet he saw nothing likely to help him but an overturned chair and a couple of crushed cushions on a settee. It was very annoying, all the more annoying because Monsieur Hanaud was so uncommonly busy. Hanaud looked carefully at the long settee and the crumpled cushions, and he took out his measure and measured the distance between the cushion at one end and the cushion at the other. He examined the table, he measured the distance between the chairs, he came to the fireplace and raked in the ashes of the burnt-out fire. But Ricardo noticed a singular thing. In the midst of his search, Hanaud's eyes were always straying back to the settee, and always with a look of extreme perplexity, as if he read there something, definitely something, but something which he could not explain. Finally he went back to it. He drew it farther away from the wall, and suddenly with a little cry he stooped and went down on his knees. When he rose he was holding some torn fragments of paper in his hand. He went over to the writing table and opened the blotting book. Where it fell open there were some sheets of notepaper, and one particular sheet of which half had been torn off. He compared the pieces which he held with that torn sheet, and seemed satisfied. There was a rack for notepaper upon the table, and from it he took a stiff card. "Get me some gum or paste, and quickly," he said. His voice had become brusque, the politeness had gone from his address. He carried the card and the fragments of paper to the round table. There he sat down, and with infinite patience gummed the fragments onto the card, fitting them together like the pieces of a Chinese puzzle. The others over his shoulders could see spaced words, written in pencil, taking shape as a sentence upon the card. Hanaud turned abruptly in his seat toward Wethermill. "You have, no doubt, a letter written by Mademoiselle Celie?" Wethermill took his letter case from his pocket, and a letter out of the case. He hesitated for a moment as he glanced over what was written. The 4 sheets were covered. He folded back the letter so that only the 2 inner sheets were visible, and handed it to Hanaud. Hanaud compared it with the handwriting upon the card. "Look," he said at length, and the 3 men gathered behind him. On the card the gummed fragments of paper revealed a sentence. "Je ne sais pas." "I do not know," said Ricardo. "Now this is very important." Beside the card Celia's letter to Wethermill was laid. "What do you think?" asked Hanaud. Besnard, the commissaire of police, bent over Hanaud's shoulder. "There are strong resemblances," he said guardedly. Ricardo was on the lookout for deep mysteries. Resemblances were not enough for him. They were inadequate to the artistic needs of the situation. "Both were written by the same hand," he said definitely, "only in the sentence written upon the card the handwriting is carefully disguised." "Ah," said the commissaire, bending forward again, "here is an idea. Yes, yes, there are strong differences." Ricardo looked triumphant. "Yes, there are differences," said Hanaud. "Look how long the upstroke of the P is, how it wavers. See how suddenly this S straggles off, as though some emotion made the hand shake. Yet this," and touching Wethermill's letter he smiled ruefully, "this is where the emotion should have affected the pen." He looked up at Wethermill's face, and then said quietly, "You have given us no opinion, monsieur. Yet your opinion should be the most valuable of all. Were these 2 papers written by the same hand?" "I do not know," answered Wethermill. "And I too," cried Hanaud in a sudden exasperation. "Je ne sais pas. I do not know. It may be her hand carelessly counterfeited. It may be her hand disguised. It may be simply that she wrote in a hurry with her gloves on." "It may have been written some time ago," said Mr. Ricardo, encouraged by his success to another suggestion. "No, that is the one thing it could not have been," said Hanaud. "Look round the room. Was there ever a room better tended? Find me a little pile of dust in any one corner if you can. It is all as clean as a plate. Every morning, except this one morning, this room has been swept and polished. The paper was written and torn up yesterday." He enclosed the card in an envelope as he spoke, and placed it in his pocket. Then he rose and crossed again to the settee. He stood at the side of it with his hands clutching the lapels of his coat, and his face gravely troubled. After a few moments of silence for himself, of suspense for all the others who watched him, he stopped suddenly. Slowly and with extraordinary care he pushed his hands under the head cushion and lifted it up gently so that the indentation of its surface might not be disarranged. He carried it over to the light of the open window. The cushion was covered with silk, and as he held it to the sunlight, all could see a small brown stain. Hanaud took his magnifying glass from his pocket and bent his head over the cushion. But at that moment, careful though he had been, the down swelled up within the cushion, the folds and indentations disappeared, the silk covering was stretched smooth. "Oh!" cried Besnard tragically. "What have you done?" Hanaud's face flushed. He had been guilty of a clumsiness, even he. Mr. Ricardo took up the tale. "Yes," he exclaimed, "what have you done?" Hanaud looked at Ricardo in amazement at his audacity. "Well, what have I done?" he asked. "Come, tell me." "You have destroyed a clue," replied Ricardo impressively. The deepest dejection at once overspread Hanaud's burly face. "Don't say that, Monsieur Ricardo. I beseech you," he implored. "A clue, and I have destroyed it. But what kind of a clue? And how have I destroyed it? And to what mystery would it be a clue if I hadn't destroyed it? And what will become of me when I go back to Paris and say in the Rue de Jérusalem, 'Let me sweep the cellars, my good friends, for Monsieur Ricardo knows that I destroyed a clue. Faithfully he promised me that he would not open his mouth, but I destroyed a clue, and his perspicacity forced him into speech.'" It was the turn of Monsieur Ricardo to grow red. Hanaud turned with a smile to Besnard. "It does not really matter whether the creases in this cushion remain," he said. "We have all seen them," and he replaced the glass in his pocket. He carried that cushion back and replaced it. Then he took the other, which lay at the foot of the settee, and carried it in its turn to the window. This was indented too, and ridged up, and just at the marks the nap of the silk was worn, and there was a slit where it had been cut. The perplexity upon Hanaud's face greatly increased. He stood with the cushion in his hands, no longer looking at it, but looking out through the doors at the footsteps so clearly defined, the footsteps of a girl who had run from this room and sprung into a motor car and driven away. He shook his head, and carrying back the cushion, laid it carefully down. Then he stood erect, gazed about the room, as though even yet he might force its secrets out from its silence, and cried with a sudden violence, "There is something here, gentlemen, which I do not understand." Mr. Ricardo heard someone beside him draw a deep breath, and turned. Wethermill stood at his elbow. A faint colour had come back to his cheeks. His eyes were fixed intently upon Hanaud's face. "What do you think?" he asked, and Hanaud replied brusquely, "It's not my business to hold opinions, monsieur. My business is to make sure." There was one point, and only one, of which he had made every one in that room sure. He had started confident. Here was a sordid crime, easily understood. But in that room he had read something which had troubled him, which had raised the sordid crime onto some higher and perplexing level. "Then Monsieur Fleuriot, after all, might be right?" asked the commissaire timidly. Hanaud stared at him for a second, then smiled. "L'affaire Dreyfus?" he cried. "Oh, la la la! No, but there is something else." What was that something? Ricardo asked himself. He looked once more about the room. He did not find his answer, but he caught sight of an ornament upon the wall, which drove the question from his mind. The ornament, if so it could be called, was a painted tambourine, with a bunch of bright ribbons tied to its rim, and it was hung upon the wall between the settee and the fireplace at about the height of a man's head. Of course it might be no more than it seemed to be, a rather gaudy and vulgar toy, such as a woman like Madame Dauvray would be very likely to choose in order to dress her walls. But it swept Ricardo's thoughts back of a sudden to the concert hall at Leamington and the apparatus of a spiritualistic show. After all, he reflected triumphantly, Hanaud had not noticed everything, and as he made the reflection, Hanaud's voice broke in to corroborate him. "We have seen everything here. Let us go upstairs," he said. "We will first visit the room of Mademoiselle Celie. Then we will question the maid, Hélène Vauquier." The four men, followed by Perrichet, passed out by the door into the hall and mounted the stairs. Celia's room was in the southwest angle of the villa, a bright and airy room, of which one window overlooked the road, and two others, between which stood the dressing-table, the garden. Behind the room a door led into a little white-tiled bathroom. Some towels were tumbled upon the floor beside the bath. In the bedroom a dark grey frock of tussore and a petticoat were flung carelessly on the bed. A big grey hat of ottoman silk was lying upon a chest of drawers in the recess of a window, and upon a chair a little pile of fine linen and a pair of grey silk stockings, which matched in shade the grey suede shoes, were tossed in a heap. "It was here that you saw the light at 9:30?" Hanaud said, turning to Perrichet. "Yes, monsieur," replied Perrichet. "We may assume, then, that Mademoiselle Celie was changing her dress at that time?" Besnard was looking about him, opening a drawer here, a wardrobe there. Mademoiselle Celie, he said with a laugh, was a particular young lady, and fond of her fine clothes, if one may judge from the room and the order of the cupboards. She must have changed her dress last night in an unusual hurry. There was about the whole room a certain daintiness, almost, it seemed to Mr. Ricardo, a fragrance, as though the girl had impressed something of her own delicate self upon it. Wethermill stood upon the threshold, watching with a sullen face the violation of this chamber by the officers of the police. No such feelings, however, troubled Hanaud. He went over to the dressing-room and opened a few small leather cases which held Celia's ornaments. In one or two of them a trinket was visible. Others were empty. One of these latter Hanaud held open in his hand, and for so long that Besnard moved impatiently. "You see it is empty, monsieur," he said, and suddenly Wethermill moved forward into the room. "Yes, I see that," said Hanaud dryly. It was a case made to hold a couple of long eardrops, those diamond eardrops, doubtless, which Mr. Ricardo had seen twinkling in the garden. "Will monsieur let me see?" asked Wethermill, and he took the case in his hands. "Yes," he said, "Mademoiselle Celie's eardrops," and he handed the case back with a thoughtful air. It was the first time he had taken a definite part in the investigation. To Ricardo the reason was clear. Harry Wethermill had himself given those eardrops to Celia. Hanaud replaced the case and turned round. "There is nothing more for us to see here," he said. "I suppose that no one has been allowed to enter the room?" And he opened the door. "No one except Helene Vauquier," replied the commissaire. Ricardo felt indignant at so obvious a piece of carelessness. Even Wethermill looked surprised. Hanaud merely shut the door again. "Oh ho, the maid," he said. "Then she has recovered." "She is still weak," said the commissaire, "but I thought it was necessary that we should obtain at once a description of what Celie Harland wore when she left the house. I spoke to Monsieur Fleuriot about it, and he gave me permission to bring Helene Vauquier here, who alone can tell us. I brought her here myself just before you came. She looked through the girl's wardrobe to see what was missing." "Was she alone in the room?" "Not for a moment," said Monsieur Besnard haughtily. "Really, monsieur, we are not so ignorant of how an affair of this kind should be conducted. I was in the room myself the whole time, with my eye upon her." "That was just before I came," said Hanaud. He crossed carelessly to the open window which overlooked the road, and leaning out of it looked up the road to the corner round which he and his friends had come, precisely as the commissaire had done. Then he turned back into the room. "Which was the last cupboard or drawer that Helene Vauquier touched?" he asked. "This one." Besnard stooped and pulled open the bottom drawer of a chest which stood in the embrasure of the window. A light-coloured dress was lying at the bottom. "I told her to be quick," said Besnard, "since I had seen that you were coming. She lifted this dress out and said that nothing was missing there. So I took her back to her room and left her with the nurse." Hanaud lifted the light dress from the drawer, shook it out in front of the window, twirled it round, snatched up a corner of it and held it to his eyes, and then, folding it quickly, replaced it in the drawer. "Now show me the first drawer she touched." And this time he lifted out a petticoat, and taking it to the window, examined it with a greater care. When he had finished with it, he handed it to Ricardo to put away, and stood for a moment or two thoughtful and absorbed. Ricardo in his turn examined the petticoat, but he could see nothing unusual. It was an attractive petticoat, dainty with frills and lace, but it was hardly a thing to grow thoughtful over. He looked up in perplexity and saw that Hanaud was watching his investigations with a smile of amusement. "When Monsieur Ricardo has put that away," he said, "we will hear what Helene Vauquier has to tell us." He passed out of the door at last, and locking it, placed the key in his pocket. "Helene Vauquier's room is, I think, upstairs," he said, and he moved towards the staircase. But as he did so, a man in plain clothes, who had been waiting upon the landing, stepped forward. He carried in his hand a piece of thin, strong whipcord. "Ah, Durette!" cried Besnard. "Monsieur Hanaud, I sent Durette this morning round the shops of Aix with the cord which was found knotted round Madame Dauvray's neck." Hanaud advanced quickly to the man. "Well, did you discover anything?" "Yes, monsieur," said Durette. At the shop of Monsieur Corval in the Rue du Casino, a young lady in a dark grey frock and hat bought some cord of this kind at a few minutes after 9 last night. It was just as the shop was being closed. I showed Corval the photograph of Célie Harland, which Monsieur le Commissaire gave me out of Madame Dauvray's room, and he identified it as the portrait of the girl who had bought the cord. Complete silence followed upon Durette's words. The whole party stood like men stupefied. No one looked towards Wethermill. Even Hanaud averted his eyes. "Yes, that is very important," he said awkwardly. He turned away and, followed by the others, went up the stairs to the bedroom of Hélène Vauquier. End of chapter 5. The Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Hélène Vauquier's Evidence. A nurse opened the door. Within the room, Hélène Vauquier was leaning back in a chair. She looked ill, and her face was very white. On the appearance of Hanaud, the commissaire, and the others, however, she rose to her feet. Ricardo recognized the justice of Hanaud's description. She stood before them, a hard-featured, tall woman of 35 or 40, in a neat black stuff dress, strong with the strength of a peasant, respectable, reliable. She looked what she had been, the confidential maid of an elderly woman. On her face there was now an aspect of eager appeal. "Oh, monsieur," she began, "let me go from here, anywhere, into prison if you like. But to stay here, where in years past we were so happy, and with Madame lying in the room below, no, it is insupportable." She sank into a chair, and Hanaud came over to her side. "Yes, yes," he said in a soothing voice. "I can understand your feelings, my poor woman. We will not keep you here. You have perhaps friends in Aix with whom you could stay?" "Oh, yes, monsieur," Hélène cried gratefully. "Oh, but I thank you. That I should have to sleep here tonight. Oh, how the fear of that has frightened me." "You need have had no such fear. After all, we are not the visitors of last night," said Hanaud, drawing a chair close to her and patting her hand sympathetically. "Now, I want you to tell these gentlemen and myself all that you know of this dreadful business. Take your time, mademoiselle. We are human." "But, monsieur, I know nothing," she cried. "I was told that I might go to bed as soon as I had dressed Mademoiselle Célie for the séance." "Séance!" cried Ricardo, startled into speech. The picture of the Assembly Hall at Leamington was again before his mind. But Hanaud turned towards him, and though Hanaud's face retained its benevolent expression, there was a glitter in his eyes which sent the blood into Ricardo's face. "Did you speak again, Monsieur Ricardo?" the detective asked. "No, I thought it was not possible." He turned back to Hélène Vauquier. "So Mademoiselle Célie practised séances. That is very strange. We will hear about them. Who knows what thread may lead us to the truth?" Hélène Vauquier shook her head. "Monsieur, it is not right that you should seek the truth from me. For, consider this, I cannot speak with justice of Mademoiselle Célie. No, I cannot. I did not like her. I was jealous, yes, jealous. Monsieur, you want the truth. I hated her." And the woman's face flushed, and she clenched her hand upon the arm of her chair. "Yes, I hated her. How could I help it?" she asked. "Why?" asked Hanaud gently. "Why could you not help it?" Hélène Vauquier leaned back again, her strength exhausted, and smiled languidly. "I will tell you. But remember it is a woman speaking to you, and things which you will count silly and trivial mean very much to her. There was one night last June, only last June, to think of it. So little while ago there was no Mademoiselle Célie." And, as Hanaud raised his hand, she said hurriedly, "Yes, yes, I will control myself. But to think of Madame Dauvray now!" And thereupon she blurted out her story, and explained to Mr. Ricardo the question which had so perplexed him, how a girl of so much distinction as Celia Harland came to be living with a woman of so common a type as Madame Dauvray. "Well, one night in June," said Hélène Vauquier, "Madame went with a party to supper at the Abbé Restaurant in Montmartre, and she brought home for the first time Mademoiselle Célie. But you should have seen her. She had on a little plaid skirt and a coat which was falling to pieces, and she was starving, yes, starving. Madame told me the story that night as I undressed her. Mademoiselle Celie was there dancing amidst the tables for a supper with anyone who would be kind enough to dance with her. The scorn of her voice rang through the room. She was the rigid, respectable peasant woman speaking out her contempt, and Wethermill must needs listen to it. Ricardo dared not glance at him. But hardly anyone would dance with her in her rags, and no one would give her supper except Madame. Madame did. Madame listened to her story of hunger and distress. Madame believed it and brought her home. Madame was so kind, so careless in her kindness. And now she lies murdered for a reward. A hysterical sob checked the woman's utterances. Her face began to work, her hands to twitch. "Come, come," said Hanaud gently. "Calm yourself, mademoiselle." Hélène Vauquier paused for a moment or two to recover her composure. "I beg your pardon, monsieur, but I have been so long with madame. Oh, the poor woman! Yes, yes, I will calm myself. Well, madame brought her home, and in a week there was nothing too good for Mademoiselle Celie. Madame was like a child. Always she was being deceived and imposed upon. Never she learnt prudence. But no one so quickly made her way to Madame's heart as Mademoiselle Celie. Mademoiselle must live with her. Mademoiselle must be dressed by the first modiste. Mademoiselle must have lace petticoats and the softest linen, long white gloves and pretty ribbons for her hair, and hats from Caroline Rebout at 1,200 francs. And Madame's maid must attend upon her and deck her out in all these dainty things. Bah! Vauquier was sitting erect in her chair, violent, almost rancorous with anger. She looked around upon the company and shrugged her shoulders. "I told you not to come to me," she said. "I cannot speak impartially or even gently of mademoiselle. Consider, for years I had been more than Madame's maid. Her friend, yes, so she was kind enough to call me. She talked to me about everything, consulted me about everything, took me with her everywhere. Then she brings home at 2 o'clock in the morning a young girl with a fresh, pretty face from a Montmartre restaurant, and in a week I am nothing at all. Oh, but nothing, and mademoiselle is queen." "Yes, it is quite natural," said Hanaud sympathetically. "You would not have been human, mademoiselle, if you had not felt some anger. But tell us frankly about these séances. How did they begin?" "Oh, monsieur," Vauquier answered, "it was not difficult to begin them. Madame d'Auvray had a passion for fortune-tellers and rogues of that kind. Anyone with a pack of cards and some nonsense about a dangerous woman with black hair, or a man with a limp, monsieur knows the stories they string together in dimly lighted rooms to deceive the credulous. Anyone could make a harvest out of Madame's superstitions. But monsieur knows the type." "Indeed I do," said Hanaud with a laugh. "Well, after mademoiselle had been with us 3 weeks, she said to me one morning when I was dressing her hair that it was a pity madame was always running round the fortune-tellers, that she herself could do something much more striking and impressive, and that if only I would help her we could rescue madame from their clutches. Sir, I did not think what power I was putting into Mademoiselle Celie's hands, or assuredly I would have refused. And I did not wish to quarrel with Mademoiselle Celie. So for once I consented, and having once consented, I could never afterwards refuse, for if I had, mademoiselle would have made some fine excuse about the psychic influence not being en rapport, and meanwhile we would have had me sent away. While if I had confessed the truth to madame, she would have been so angry that I had been a party to tricking her that again I would have lost my place. And so the séances went on." "Yes," said Hanaud. "I understand that your position was very difficult. We shall not, I think," and he turned to the commissaire confidently for corroboration of his words, "be disposed to blame you." "Certainly not," said the commissaire. "After all, life is not so easy." "Thus, then, the séances began," said Hanaud, leaning forward with a keen interest. "This is a strange and curious story you are telling me, Mademoiselle Vauquier. Now, how were they conducted? How did you assist? What did Mademoiselle Celie do? rap on the tables in the dark and rattle tambourines like that one with the knot of ribbons which hangs upon the wall of the salon?" There was a gentle and inviting irony in Hanaud's tone. Monsieur Ricardo was disappointed. Hanaud had, after all, not overlooked the tambourine. Without Ricardo's reason to notice it, he had none the less observed it and borne it in his memory. "Well?" he asked. "Oh, monsieur, the tambourines and the rapping on the table," cried Helene. "That was nothing, oh, but nothing at all. Mademoiselle Celie would make spirits appear and speak." "Really? And she was never caught out. But Mademoiselle Celie must have been a remarkably clever girl." "Oh, she was of an address which was surprising. Sometimes Madame and I were alone. Sometimes there were others whom Madame in her pride had invited, for she was very proud, monsieur, that her companion could introduce her to the spirits of dead people. But never was Mademoiselle Celie caught out. She told me that for many years, even when quite a child, she had travelled through England giving these exhibitions." "Oh ho!" said Hanaud, and he turned to Wethermill. "Did you know that?" he asked in English. "I did not," he said. "I do not now." Hanaud shook his head. "To me this story does not seem invented," he replied. And then he spoke again in French to Helene Vauquier. "Well, continue, mademoiselle. Assume that the company is assembled for our séance." Then Mademoiselle Celie, dressed in a long gown of black velvet, which set off her white arms and shoulders well. Oh, mademoiselle did not forget these little trifles. Helene Vauquier interrupted her story with a return of her bitterness to interpolate. Mademoiselle would sail into the room with her velvet train flowing behind her, and perhaps for a little while she would say there was a force working against her, and she would sit silent in a chair while Madame gaped at her with open eyes. At last Mademoiselle would say that the powers were favourable, and the spirits would manifest themselves tonight. Then she would be placed in a cabinet, perhaps with a string tied across the door outside. You will understand it was my business to see after the string. And the lights would be turned down, or perhaps out altogether. Or at other times we would sit holding hands round a table, Mademoiselle Celie between Madame Dauvray and myself. But in that case the lights would be turned out first, and it would be really my hand which held Madame Dauvray's. And whether it was the cabinet or the chairs, in a moment Mademoiselle would be creeping silently about the room in a little pair of soft-soled slippers without heels, which she wore so that she might not be heard, and tambourines would rattle, as you say, and fingers touch the forehead and the neck, and strange voices would sound from corners of the room, and dim apparitions would appear, the spirits of great ladies of the past, who would talk with Madame Dauvray. Such ladies as Madame de Castiglione, Marie Antoinette, Madame de Medici, I do not remember all the names, and very likely I do not pronounce them properly. Then the voices would cease and the lights be turned up, and Mademoiselle Celie would be found in a trance just in the same place and attitude as she had been when the lights were turned out. Imagine, messieurs, the effect of such séances upon a woman like Madame Dauvray. She was made for them. She believed in them implicitly. The words of the great ladies from the past. She would remember and repeat them, and be very proud that such great ladies had come back to the world merely to tell her, Madame Dauvray, about their lives. She would have had séances all day, but Mademoiselle Celie pleaded that she was left exhausted at the end of them. But Mademoiselle Celie was of an address. For instance, it will seem very absurd and ridiculous to you, gentlemen, but you must remember what Madame Dauvray was. For instance, Madame was particularly anxious to speak with the spirit of Madame de Montespan. Yes, yes, she had read all the memoirs about that lady. Very likely Mademoiselle Celie had put the notion into Madame Dauvray's head, for Madame was not a scholar. But she was dying to hear that famous woman's voice, and to catch a dim glimpse of her face. Well, she was never gratified. Always she hoped. Always Mademoiselle Celie tantalized her with the hope. But she would not gratify it. She would not spoil her fine affairs by making these treats too common. And she acquired, how should she not, a power over Madame Dauvray which was unassailable. The fortune-tellers had no more to say to Madame Dauvray. She did nothing but felicitate herself upon the happy chance which had sent her Mademoiselle Celie. And now she lies in her room murdered. Once more Hélène's voice broke upon the words, but Hanaud poured her out a glass of water and held it to her lips. Hélène drank it eagerly. "There, that is better, is it not?" he said. "Yes, monsieur," said Hélène Vauquier, recovering herself. "Sometimes, too," she resumed, "messages from the spirits would flutter down in writing on the table." "In writing?" exclaimed Hanaud quickly. "Yes, answers to questions. Mademoiselle Celie had them ready. Oh, but she was of an address altogether surprising." "I see," said Hanaud slowly, and he added, "But sometimes I suppose the questions were questions which Mademoiselle Celie could not answer?" "Sometimes," Hélène Vauquier admitted, "when visitors were present. When Madame Dauvray was alone, well, she was an ignorant woman, and any answer would serve. But it was not so when there were visitors whom Mademoiselle Celie did not know, or only knew slightly. These visitors might be putting questions to test her, of which they knew the answers, while Mademoiselle Celie did not." "Exactly," said Hanaud. "What happened then?" All who were listening understood to what point he was leading Hélène Vauquier. All waited intently for her answer. She smiled. "It was all one to Mademoiselle Celie." "She was prepared with an escape from the difficulty?" "Perfectly prepared." Hanaud looked puzzled. "I can think of no way out of it except the one," and he looked round to the Commissaire and to Ricardo, as though he would inquire of them how many ways they had discovered. "I can think of no escape except that a message in writing should flutter down from the spirit appealed to, saying frankly," and Hanaud shrugged his shoulders, "I do not know." "Oh, no, no, monsieur," replied Hélène Vauquier, in pity for Hanaud's misconception. "I see that you are not in the habit of attending séances. It would never do for a spirit to admit that it did not know. At once its authority would be gone, and with it Mademoiselle Celie's as well. But on the other hand, for inscrutable reasons, the spirit might not be allowed to answer." "I understand," said Hanaud, meekly accepting the correction. "The spirit might reply that it was forbidden to answer, but never that it did not know." "No, never that," agreed Hélène. So it seemed that Hanaud must look elsewhere for the explanation of that sentence. "I do not know." Hélène continued. "Oh, Mademoiselle Celie, it was not easy to baffle her, I can tell you. She carried a lace scarf which she could drape about her head, and in a moment she would be, in the dim light, an old, old woman, with a voice so altered that no one could know it. Indeed, you said rightly, monsieur, she was clever." To all who listened, Hélène Vauquier's story carried its conviction. Madame Dauvray rose vividly before their minds as a living woman. Celie's trickeries were so glibly described that they could hardly have been invented, and certainly not by this poor peasant woman whose lips so bravely struggled with Medici and Montespan and the names of the other great ladies. How indeed should she know of them at all? She could never have had the inspiration to concoct the most convincing item of her story, the queer craze of Madame Dauvray for an interview with Madame de Montespan. These details were assuredly the truth. Ricardo, indeed, knew them to be true. Had he not himself seen the girl in her black velvet dress, shut up in a cabinet, and a great lady of the past dimly appearing in the darkness? Moreover, Hélène Vauquier's jealousy was so natural and inevitable a thing. Her confession of it corroborated all her story. "Well, then," said Hanaud, "we come to last night. There was a séance held in the salon last night." "No, monsieur," said Vauquier, shaking her head. "There was no séance last night." "But already you have said," interrupted the Commissaire, and Hanaud held up his hand. "Let her speak, my friend." "Yes, monsieur shall hear," said Vauquier. It appeared that at 5 o'clock in the afternoon Madame Dauvray and Mademoiselle Celie prepared to leave the house on foot. It was their custom to walk down at this hour to the Villa des Fleurs, pass an hour or so there, dine in a restaurant, and return to the rooms to spend the evening. On this occasion, however, Madame Dauvray informed Helene that they should be back early and bring with them a friend who was interested in, but entirely sceptical of, spiritualistic manifestations. "But we shall convince her tonight, Celie," she said confidently, and the two women then went out. Shortly before 8, Helene closed the shutters both of the upstair and the downstair windows, and of the glass doors in the garden, and returned to the kitchen, which was at the back of the house, that is, on the side facing the road. There had been a fall of rain at 7, which had lasted for the greater part of the hour, and soon after she had shut the windows the rain fell again in a heavy shower, and Helene, knowing that Madame felt the chill, lighted a small fire in the salon. The shower lasted until nearly 9, when it ceased altogether, and the night cleared up. It was close upon 9:30 when the bell rang from the salon. Vauquier was sure of the hour, for the charwoman called her attention to the clock. "I found Madame Dauvray, Mademoiselle Celie, and another woman in the salon," continued Helene Vauquier. Madame had let them in with her latchkey. "Ah, the other woman!" cried Besnard. "Had you seen her before?" "No, monsieur." "What was she like?" "She was sallow, with black hair and bright eyes like beads. She was short and about 45 years old, though it is difficult to judge of these things. I noticed her hands, for she was taking her gloves off, and they seemed to me to be unusually muscular for a woman." "Ah!" cried Louis Besnard, "that is important." Madame Dauvray was, as she always was before a séance, in a feverish flutter. "You will help Mademoiselle Celie to dress, Helene, and be very quick," she said, and with an extraordinary longing she added, "Perhaps we shall see her tonight." Her, you understand, was Madame de Montespan. And she turned to the stranger and said, "You will believe, Adèle, after tonight." "Adèle," said the Commissaire wisely. "Then Adèle was the strange woman's name?" "Perhaps," said Hanaud dryly. Helene Vauquier reflected. "I think Adèle was the name," she said in a more doubtful tone. "It sounded like Adèle." The irrepressible Mr. Ricardo was impelled to intervene. "What Monsieur Hanaud means," he explained, with the pleasant air of a man happy to illuminate the dark intelligence of a child, "is that Adèle was probably a pseudonym." Hanaud turned to him with a savage grin. "Now that is sure to help her," he cried. "A pseudonym! Helene Vauquier is sure to understand that simple and elementary word. How bright this Monsieur Ricardo is! Where shall we find a new pin more bright? I ask you." And he spread out his hands in a despairing admiration. Mr. Ricardo flushed red, but he answered never a word. He must endure gibes and humiliations like a schoolboy in a class. His one constant fear was lest he should be turned out of the room. The Commissaire diverted wrath from him, however. "What he means by pseudonym," he said to Helene Vauquier, explaining Mr. Ricardo to her as Mr. Ricardo had presumed to explain Hanaud, "is a false name. Adèle may have been, nay, probably was, a false name adopted by this strange woman." "Adèle, I think, was the name used," replied Helene, the doubt in her voice diminishing as she searched her memory. "I am almost sure." "Well, we will call her Adèle," said Hanaud impatiently. "What does it matter? Go on, Mademoiselle Vauquier." The lady sat upright and squarely upon the edge of a chair with a sort of defiance, as though she was determined nothing should convince her, and she laughed incredulously. Here again all who heard were able vividly to conjure up the scene: the defiant sceptic sitting squarely on the edge of her chair, removing her gloves from her muscular hands; the excited Madame Dauvray so absorbed in the determination to convince; and Mademoiselle Celie running from the room to put on the black gown which would not be visible in the dim light. "Whilst I took off Mademoiselle's dress," Vauquier continued, "she said, 'When I have gone down to the salon you can go to bed, Helene. Madame Adèle, yes, it was Adèle, will be fetched by a friend in a motor car, and I can let her out and fasten the door again. So if you hear the car you will know that it has come for her.'" "Oh, she said that?" said Hanaud quickly. "Yes, monsieur." Hanaud looked gloomily towards Wethermill. Then he exchanged a sharp glance with the Commissaire, and moved his shoulders in an almost imperceptible shrug. but Mr. Ricardo saw it and construed it into one word. He imagined a jury uttering the word guilty. Helene Vauquier saw the movement too. "Do not condemn her too quickly, monsieur," she said, with an impulse of remorse, "and not upon my words, for, as I say, I hated her." Hanaud nodded reassuringly, and she resumed. "I was surprised, and I asked mademoiselle what she would do without her confederate. But she laughed and said there would be no difficulty. That is partly why I think there was no séance held last night. Monsieur, there was a note in her voice that evening which I did not as yet understand. Mademoiselle then took her bath, while I laid out her black dress and the slippers with the soft, noiseless soles. And now I tell you why I am sure there was no séance last night, why Mademoiselle Celie never meant there should be one." "Yes, let us hear that," said Hanaud curiously, and leaning forward with his hands upon his knees. "You have here, monsieur, a description of how mademoiselle was dressed when she went away." Helene Vauquier picked up a sheet of paper from the table at her side. "I wrote it out at the request of monsieur le commissaire." She handed the paper to Hanaud, who glanced through it as she continued. "Well, except for the white lace coat, monsieur, I dressed Mademoiselle Celie just in that way. She would have none of her plain black robe. No, Mademoiselle Celie must wear her fine new evening frock of pale reseda green chiffon over a soft clinging satin, which set off her fair beauty so prettily. It left her white arms and shoulders bare, and it had a long train, and it rustled as she moved. And with that she must have put on her pale green silk stockings, her new little satin slippers to match with the large paste buckles, and a sash of green satin looped through another glittering buckle at the side of the waist, with long ends loosely knotted together at the knee. I must tie her fair hair with a silver ribbon, and pin upon her curls a large hat of reseda green, with a golden brown ostrich feather drooping behind. I warned mademoiselle that there was a tiny fire burning in the salon. Even with the fire screen in front of it there would still be a little light upon the floor, and the glittering buckles on her feet would betray her, even if the rustle of her dress did not. But she said she would kick her slippers off. Ah, gentlemen, it is, after all, not so that one dresses for a séance, she cried, shaking her head, but it is just so, is it not, that one dresses to go to meet a lover. The suggestion startled everyone who heard it. It fairly took Mr. Ricardo's breath away. Wethermill stepped forward with a cry of revolt. The commissaire exclaimed admiringly, "But here is an idea!" Even Hanaud sat back in his chair, though his expression lost nothing of its impassivity, and his eyes never moved from Helene Vauquier's face. "Listen," she continued, "I will tell you what I think. It was my habit to put out some sirop and lemonade and some little cakes in the dining room, which, as you know, is at the other side of the house across the hall. I think it possible, messieurs, that while Mademoiselle Celie was changing her dress, Madame Dauvray and the stranger Adèle went into the dining room. I know that Mademoiselle Celie, as soon as she was dressed, ran downstairs to the salon. Well then, suppose Mademoiselle Celie had a lover waiting with whom she meant to run away. She hurries through the empty salon, opens the glass doors, and is gone, leaving the doors open. And the thief, an accomplice of Adèle, finds the doors open and hides himself in the salon until Madame Dauvray returns from the dining room. You see, that leaves Mademoiselle Celie innocent." Vauquier leaned forward eagerly, her white face flushing. There was a moment's silence, and then Hanaud said, "That is all very well, Mademoiselle Vauquier, but it does not account for the lace coat in which the girl went away. She must have returned to her room to fetch that after you had gone to bed." Helene Vauquier leaned back with an air of disappointment. "That is true. I had forgotten the coat. I did not like Mademoiselle Celie, but I am not wicked." "Nor for the fact that the sirop and the lemonade had not been touched in the dining room," said the commissaire, interrupting her. Again the disappointment overspread Vauquier's face. "Is that so?" she asked. "I did not know. I have been kept a prisoner here." The commissaire cut her short with a cry of satisfaction. "Listen, listen!" he exclaimed excitedly. "Here is a theory which accounts for all, which combines Vauquier's idea with ours, and Vauquier's idea is, I think, very just, up to a point. Suppose, Monsieur Hanaud, that the girl was going to meet her lover, but the lover is the murderer. Then all becomes clear. She does not run away to him. She opens the door for him and lets him in." Both Hanaud and Ricardo stole a glance at Wethermill. How did he take the theory? Wethermill was leaning against the wall, his eyes closed, his face white and contorted with a spasm of pain. But he had the air of a man silently enduring an outrage rather than struck down by the conviction that the woman he loved was worthless. "It is not for me to say, monsieur," Helene Vauquier continued. "I only tell you what I know. I am a woman, and it would be very difficult for a girl who was eagerly expecting her lover so to act that another woman would not know it. However uncultivated and ignorant the other woman was, that, at all events, she would know. The knowledge would spread to her of itself, without a word. Consider, gentlemen." And suddenly Helene Vauquier smiled. "A young girl, tingling with excitement from head to foot, eager that her beauty just at this moment should be more fresh, more sweet than ever it was, careful that her dress should set it exquisitely off. Imagine it! Her lips ready for the kiss. Oh, how should another woman not know? I saw Mademoiselle Celie, her cheeks rosy, her eyes bright. Never had she looked so lovely. The pale green hat upon her fair head, heavy with its curls. From head to foot she looked herself over, and then she sighed. She sighed with pleasure because she looked so pretty. That was Mademoiselle Celie last night, monsieur. She gathered up her train, took her long white gloves in the other hand, and ran down the stairs, her heels clicking on the wood, her buckles glittering. At the bottom she turned and said to me, 'Remember, Helene, you can go to bed.' That was it, monsieur." And now violently the rancour of Helene Vauquier's feelings burst out once more. For her, the fine clothes, the pleasure and the happiness. For me, I could go to bed. Hanaud looked again at the description which Helene Vauquier had written out, and read it through carefully. Then he asked a question of which Ricardo did not quite see the drift. "So," he said, "when this morning you suggested to Monsieur the Commissaire that it would be advisable for you to go through Mademoiselle Celie's wardrobe, you found that nothing more had been taken away except the white lace coat?" "That is so." "Very well. Now, after Mademoiselle Celie had gone down the stairs?" "I put the lights out in her room, and as she had ordered me to do, I went to bed. The next thing that I remember, but no, it terrifies me too much to think of it." Helene shuddered and covered her face spasmodically with her hands. Hanaud drew her hands gently down. "Courage! You are safe now, mademoiselle. Calm yourself." She lay back with her eyes closed. "Yes, yes, it is true I am safe now. But oh, I feel I shall never dare to sleep again." And the tears swam in her eyes. "I woke up with the feeling of being suffocated. Mon Dieu! There was the light burning in the room, and a woman, the strange woman with the strong hands, was holding me down by the shoulders, while a man with his cap drawn over his eyes and a little black moustache pressed over my lips a pad from which a horribly sweet and sickly taste filled my mouth. The man, with the arm which was free, held me close to him, and she bound my hands with a cord behind me. Look!" She held out her wrists. They were terribly bruised. Red and angry lines showed where the cord had cut deeply into her flesh. Then they flung me down again upon my back, and the next thing I remember is the doctor standing over me, and this kind nurse supporting me. She sank back exhausted in her chair and wiped her forehead with her handkerchief. The sweat stood upon it in beads. "Thank you, mademoiselle," said Hanaud gravely. "This has been a trying ordeal for you. I understand that. But we are coming to the end. I want you to read this description of Mademoiselle Celie through again, to make sure that nothing is omitted." He gave the paper into the maid's hands. "It will be advertised, so it is important that it should be complete. See that you have left out nothing." Helene Vauquier bent her head over the paper. "No," said Helene at last, "I do not think I have omitted anything," and she handed the paper back. "I asked you," Hanaud continued suavely, "because I understand that Mademoiselle Celie usually wore a pair of diamond eardrops, and they are not mentioned here." A faint colour came into the maid's face. "That is true, monsieur. I had forgotten. It is quite true." "Anyone might forget," said Hanaud, with a reassuring smile. "But you will remember now. Think. Did Mademoiselle Celie wear them last night?" He leaned forward, waiting for her reply. Wethermill, too, made a movement. Both men evidently thought the point of great importance. The maid looked at Hanaud for a few moments without speaking. "It is not from me, mademoiselle, that you will get the answer," said Hanaud quietly. "No, monsieur, I was thinking," said the maid, her face flushing at the rebuke. "Did she wear them when she went down the stairs last night?" he insisted. "I think she wore them," she said doubtfully. Yes," and the words came now firm and clear. "I remember well. Mademoiselle Celie had taken them off before her bath, and they lay on the dressing table. She put them into her ears while I dressed her hair and arranged the bow of the ribbon in it." "Then we will add the earrings to your description," said Hanaud, as he rose from his chair with the paper in his hand. "And for the moment we need not trouble you any more about Mademoiselle Celie." He folded the paper up, slipped it into his letter case, and put it away in his pocket. "Let us consider that poor Madame Dauvray. Did she keep much money in the house?" "No, monsieur, very little. She was well known in Aix, and her cheques were everywhere accepted without question. It was a high pleasure to serve madame. Her credit was so good," said Helene Vauquier, raising her head as though she herself had a share in the pride of that good credit. "No doubt," Hanaud agreed. "There are many fine households where the banking account is overdrawn, and it cannot be pleasant for the servants." "They are put to so many shifts to hide it from the servants of their neighbours," said Helene. "Besides," and she made a little grimace of contempt, "a fine household and an overdrawn banking account. It is like a ragged petticoat under a satin dress. That was never the case with Madame Dauvray." "So that she was under no necessity to have ready money always in her pocket," said Hanaud. "I understand that. But at times perhaps she won at the Villa des Fleurs?" Helene Vauquier shook her head. "She loved the Villa des Fleurs, but she never played for high sums, and often never played at all. If she won a few louis, she was as delighted with her gains, and as afraid to lose them again at the tables, as if she were of the poorest, and she stopped at once. No, monsieur. 20 or 30 louis, there was never more than that in the house." "Then it was certainly for her famous collection of jewellery that Madame Dauvray was murdered?" "Certainly, monsieur." "Now, where did she keep her jewellery?" "In a safe in her bedroom, monsieur. Every night she took off what she had been wearing and locked it up with the rest. She was never too tired for that." "And what did she do with the keys?" "That I cannot tell you. Certainly she locked her rings and necklaces away whilst I undressed her, and she laid the keys upon the dressing table or the mantel-shelf, anywhere. But in the morning the keys were no longer where she had left them. She had put them secretly away." Hanaud turned to another point. "I suppose that Mademoiselle Celie knew of the safe, and that the jewels were kept there?" "Oh, yes. Mademoiselle indeed was often in Madame Dauvray's room when she was dressing or undressing. She must often have seen madame take them out and lock them up again. But then, monsieur, so did I." Hanaud nodded to her with a friendly smile. "Thank you once more, mademoiselle," he said. "The torture is over. But of course Monsieur Fleuriot will require your presence." Helene Vauquier looked anxiously towards him. "But meanwhile I can go from this villa, monsieur?" she pleaded, with a trembling voice. "Certainly. You shall go to your friends at once." "Oh, monsieur, thank you!" she cried, and suddenly she gave way. The tears began to flow from her eyes. She buried her face in her hands and sobbed. "It is foolish of me, but what would you?" She jerked out the words between her sobs. "It has been too terrible." "Yes, yes," said Hanaud soothingly. "The nurse will put a few things together for you in a bag. You will not leave Aix, of course, and I will send someone with you to your friends." The maid started violently. "Oh, not a sergent de ville, monsieur. I beg of you. I should be disgraced." "No, it shall be a man in plain clothes, to see that you are not hindered by reporters on the way." Hanaud turned towards the door. On the dressing table a cord was lying. He took it up and spoke to the nurse. "Was this the cord with which Helene Vauquier's hands were tied?" "Yes, monsieur," she replied. Hanaud handed it to the commissaire. "It will be necessary to keep that," he said. It was a thin piece of strong whipcord. It was the same kind of cord as that which had been found tied around Madame Dauvray's throat. Hanaud opened the door and turned back to the nurse. "We will send a cab for Mademoiselle Vauquier. You will drive with her to her door. I think, after that, she will need no further help. Pack up a few things and bring them down. Mademoiselle Vauquier can follow, no doubt, now without assistance." And with a friendly nod he left the room. Ricardo had been wondering through the examination in what light Hanaud considered Helene Vauquier. He was sympathetic, but the sympathy might merely have been assumed to deceive. His questions betrayed in no particular the colour of his mind. Now, however, he made himself clear. He informed the nurse in the plainest possible way that she was no longer to act as jailer. She was to bring Vauquier's things down, but Vauquier could follow by herself. Evidently, Helene Vauquier was cleared. End of chapter 6. Of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. A Startling Discovery. Harry Wethermill, however, was not so easily satisfied. "Surely, monsieur, it would be well to know whither she is going," he said, "and to make sure that when she has gone there she will stay there until we want her again?" Hanaud looked at the young man pityingly. "I can understand, monsieur, that you hold strong views about Helene Vauquier. You are human like the rest of us, and what she has said to us just now would not make you more friendly. But, and he preferred to shrug his shoulders rather than to finish in words his sentence. However, he said, we shall take care to know where Helene Vauquier is staying. Indeed, if she is at all implicated in this affair, we shall learn more if we leave her free than if we keep her under lock and key. You see that if we leave her quite free, but watch her very, very carefully, so as to awaken no suspicion, she may be emboldened to do something rash, or the others may." Mr. Ricardo approved of Hanaud's reasoning. "That is quite true," he said. "She might write a letter." "Yes, or receive one," added Hanaud, "which would be still more satisfactory for us, supposing, of course, that she has anything to do with this affair." And again he shrugged his shoulders. He turned towards the commissaire. "You have a discreet officer whom you can trust?" he asked. "Certainly, a dozen." "I want only one." "And here he is," said the commissaire. They were descending the stairs. On the landing of the first floor, Durette, the man who had discovered where the cord was bought, was still waiting. Hanaud took Durette by the sleeve in the familiar way which he so commonly used, and led him to the top of the stairs, where the two men stood for a few moments apart. It was plain that Hanaud was giving, Durette receiving, definite instructions. Durette descended the stairs. Hanaud came back to the others. "I have told him to fetch a cab," he said, "and convey Helene Vauquier to her friends." Then he looked at Ricardo, and from Ricardo to the commissaire, while he rubbed his hand backwards and forwards across his shaven chin. "I tell you," he said, "I find this sinister little drama very interesting to me. The sordid, miserable struggle for mastery in this household of Madame Dauvray, eh? Yes, very interesting. Just as much patience, just as much effort, just as much planning for this small end as a general uses to defeat an army, and at the last nothing gained. What else is politics? Yes, very interesting." His eyes rested upon Wethermill's face for a moment, but they gave the young man no hope. He took a key from his pocket. "We need not keep this room locked," he said. "We know all that there is to be known." And he inserted the key into the lock of Celia's room and turned it. "But is that wise, monsieur?" said Besnard. Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. "Why not?" he asked. "The case is in your hands," said the commissaire. To Ricardo the proceedings seemed singularly irregular, but if the commissaire was content, it was not for him to object. "And where is my excellent friend Perrichet?" asked Hanaud, and leaning over the balustrade he called him up from the hall. "We will now," said Hanaud, "have a glance into this poor murdered woman's room." The room was opposite to Celia's. Besnard produced the key and unlocked the door. Hanaud took off his hat upon the threshold, and then passed into the room with his companions. Upon the bed, outlined under a sheet, lay the rigid form of Madame Dauvray. Hanaud stepped gently to the bedside and reverently uncovered the face. For a moment all could see it, livid, swollen, unhuman. "A brutal business," he said in a low voice, and when he turned again to his companions his face was white and sickly. He replaced the sheet and gazed about the room. It was decorated and furnished in the same style as the salon downstairs, yet the contrast between the two rooms was remarkable. Downstairs in the salon only a chair had been overturned. Here there was every sign of violence and disorder. An empty safe stood open in one corner. The rugs upon the polished floor had been tossed aside. Every drawer had been torn open, every wardrobe burst. The very bed had been moved from its position. "It was in this safe that Madame Dauvray hid her jewels each night," said the Commissaire as Hanaud gazed about the room. "Oh, was it so?" Hanaud asked slowly. It seemed to Ricardo that he read something in the aspect of this room too, which troubled his mind and increased his perplexity. "Yes," said Besnard confidently. "Every night Madame Dauvray locked her jewels away in this safe. Vauquier told us so this morning. Every night she was never too tired for that. Besides, here," and putting his hand into the safe he drew out a paper, "here is the list of Madame Dauvray's jewellery." Plainly, however, Hanaud was not satisfied. He took the list and glanced through the items, but his thoughts were not concerned with it. "If that is so," he said slowly, "Madame Dauvray kept her jewels in this safe. Why has every drawer been ransacked? Why was the bed moved? Perrichet, lock the door, quietly, from the inside. That is right. Now lean your back against it." Hanaud waited until he saw Perrichet's broad back against the door. Then he went down upon his knees, and tossing the rugs here and there, examined with minutest care the inlaid floor. By the side of the bed a Persian mat of blue silk was spread. This in its turn he moved quickly aside. He bent his eyes to the ground, lay prone, moved this way and that to catch the light upon the floor. Then with a spring he rose to his knees. He lifted his finger to his lips. In a dead silence he drew a penknife quickly from his pocket and opened it. He bent down again and inserted the blade between the cracks of the blocks. The three men in the room watched him with an intense excitement. A block of wood rose from the floor. He pulled it out, laid it noiselessly down, and inserted his hand into the opening. Wethermill, at Ricardo's elbow, uttered a stifled cry. "Hush!" whispered Hanaud angrily. He drew out his hand again. It was holding a green leather jewel case. He opened it, and a diamond necklace flashed its thousand colours in their faces. He thrust in his hand again and again and again, and each time that he withdrew it, it held a jewel case. Before the astonished eyes of his companions he opened them. Ropes of pearls, collars of diamonds, necklaces of emeralds, rings of pigeon-blood rubies, bracelets of gold studded with opals. Madame Dauvray's various jewellery was disclosed. "But that is astounding," said Besnard in an awestruck voice. "Then she was never robbed at all," cried Ricardo. Hanaud rose to his feet. "What a piece of irony," he whispered. "The poor woman is murdered for her jewels, the rooms turned upside down, and nothing is found. For all the while they lay safe in this cache. Nothing is taken except what she wore. Let us see what she wore." "Only a few rings," Helene Vauquier thought, said Besnard, but she was not sure. "Ah," said Hanaud, "well, let us make sure." And taking the list from the safe he compared it with the jewellery and the cases on the floor, ticking off the items one by one. When he had finished he knelt down again, and thrusting his hand into the hole felt carefully about. "There is a pearl necklace missing," he said, "a valuable necklace from the description in the list and some rings. She must have been wearing them." And he sat back upon his heels. "We will send the intelligent Perrichet for a bag," he said, "and we will counsel the intelligent Perrichet not to breathe a word to any living soul of what he has seen in the room. Then we will seal up in the bag the jewels, and we will hand it over to Monsieur le Commissaire, who will convey it with the greatest secrecy out of this villa. For the list, I will keep it." And he placed it carefully in his pocket-book. He unlocked the door and went out himself onto the landing. He looked down the stairs and up the stairs, and then he beckoned Perrichet to him. "Go," he whispered. "Be quick, and when you come back hide the bag carefully under your coat." Perrichet went down the stairs with pride written upon his face. Was he not assisting the great Monsieur Hanaud from the Sûreté in Paris? Hanaud returned to Madame Dauvray's room and closed the door. He looked into the eyes of his companions. "Can't you see the scene?" he asked, with a queer smile of excitement. He had forgotten Wethermill. He had forgotten even the dead woman shrouded beneath the sheet. He was absorbed. His eyes were bright, his whole face vivid with life. Ricardo saw the real man at this moment, and feared for the happiness of Harry Wethermill. For nothing would Hanaud now turn aside until he had reached the truth and set his hands upon the quarry. Of that Ricardo felt sure. He was trying now to make his companions visualize just what he saw and understood. "Can't you see it? The old woman locking up her jewels in this safe every night before the eyes of her maid or her companion, and then, as soon as she was alone, taking them stealthily out of the safe and hiding them in this secret place? But I tell you, this is human. Yes, it is interesting just because it is so human. Then picture to yourselves last night the murderers opening this safe and finding nothing, oh, but nothing, and ransacking the room in deadly haste, kicking up the rugs, forcing open the drawers, and always finding nothing, nothing, nothing. Think of their rage, their stupefaction, and finally their fear. They must go, and with one pearl necklace, when they had hoped to reap a great fortune. Oh, but this is interesting. Yes, I tell you, I who have seen many strange things, this is interesting." Perrichet returned with the canvas bag into which Hanaud placed the jewel cases. He sealed the bag in the presence of the four men and handed it to Besnard. He replaced the block of wood in the floor, covered it over again with the rug, and rose to his feet. "Listen," he said in a low voice, and with a gravity which impressed them all. "There is something in this house which I do not understand. I have told you so. I tell you something more now. I am afraid. I am afraid." And the word startled his hearers like a thunderclap, though it was breathed no louder than a whisper. "Yes, my friends," he repeated, nodding his head, "terribly afraid." And upon the others fell a discomfort, an awe, as though something sinister and dangerous were present in the room and close to them. So vivid was the feeling, instinctively they drew nearer together. "Now I warn you solemnly. There must be no whisper that these jewels have been discovered. No newspaper must publish a hint of it. No one must suspect that here in this room we have found them. Is that understood?" "Certainly," said the Commissaire. "Yes," said Mr. Ricardo. "To be sure, monsieur," said Perrichet. As for Harry Wethermill, he made no reply. His burning eyes were fixed upon Hanaud's face, and that was all. Hanaud, for his part, asked for no reply from him. Indeed, he did not look towards Harry Wethermill's face at all. Ricardo understood. Hanaud did not mean to be deterred by the suffering written there. He went down again into the little gay salon lit with flowers and August sunlight, and stood beside the couch gazing at it with troubled eyes. And as he gazed he closed his eyes and shivered. He shivered like a man who has taken a sudden chill. Nothing in all this morning's investigations, not even the rigid body beneath the sheet, nor the strange discovery of the jewels, had so impressed Ricardo. For there he had been confronted with facts, definite and complete. Here was the suggestion of unknown horrors, a hint, not a fact, compelling the imagination to dark conjecture. Hanaud shivered. That he had no idea why Hanaud shivered made the action still more significant, still more alarming. And it was not Ricardo alone who was moved by it. A voice of despair rang through the room. The voice was Harry Wethermill's, and his face was ashy white. "Monsieur," he cried, "I do not know what makes you shudder, but I am remembering a few words you used this morning." Hanaud turned upon his heel. His face was drawn and grey, and his eyes blazed. "My friend, I also am remembering those words," he said. Thus the two men stood confronting one another, eye to eye, with awe and fear in both their faces. Ricardo was wondering to what words they both referred when the sound of wheels broke in upon the silence. The effect upon Hanaud was magical. He thrust his hands into his pockets. "Helene Vauquier's cab," he said lightly. He drew out his cigarette case and lighted a cigarette. "Let us see that poor woman safely off. It is a closed cab, I hope." It was a closed landau. It drove past the open door of the salon to the front door of the house. In Hanaud's wake they all went into the hall. The nurse came down alone, carrying Helene Vauquier's bag. She placed it in the cab and waited in the doorway. "Perhaps Helene Vauquier has fainted," she said anxiously. "She does not come." And she moved towards the stairs. Hanaud took a singularly swift step forward and stopped her. "Why should you think that?" he asked, with a queer smile upon his face. And as he spoke a door closed gently upstairs. "See," he continued, "you are wrong. She is coming." Ricardo was puzzled. It had seemed to him that the door which had closed so gently was nearer than Helene Vauquier's door. It seemed to him that the door was upon the first, not the second landing. But Hanaud had noticed nothing strange, so it could not be. He greeted Helene Vauquier with a smile as she came down the stairs. "You are better, mademoiselle," he said politely. "One can see that. There is more colour in your cheeks. A day or two and you will be yourself again." He held the door open while she got into the cab. The nurse took her seat beside her. Durette mounted on the box. The cab turned and went down the drive. "Good-bye, mademoiselle," cried Hanaud, and he watched until the high shrubs hid the cab from his eyes. Then he behaved in an extraordinary way. He turned and sprang like lightning up the stairs. His agility amazed Ricardo. The others followed upon his heels. He flung himself at Celia's door and opened it. He burst into the room, stood for a second, then ran to the window. He hid behind the curtain, looking out. With his hand he waved to his companions to keep back. The sound of wheels creaking and rasping rose to their ears. The cab had just come out into the road. Durette upon the box turned and looked towards the house. Just for a moment Hanaud leaned from the window, as Besnard the commissaire had done, and like Besnard again he waved his hand. Then he came back into the room and saw, standing in front of him with his mouth open and his eyes starting out of his head, Perrichet, the intelligent Perrichet. "Monsieur," cried Perrichet, "something has been taken from this room." Hanaud looked round the room and shook his head. "No," he said. "But yes, monsieur," Perrichet insisted. "Oh, but yes. See, upon this dressing table there was a small pot of cold cream. It stood here, where my finger is, when we were in this room an hour ago. Now it is gone." Hanaud burst into a laugh. "My friend Perrichet," he said ironically, "I will tell you the newspaper did not do you justice. You are more intelligent. The truth, my excellent friend, lies at the bottom of a well, but you would find it at the bottom of a pot of cold cream. Now let us go, for in this house, gentlemen, we have nothing more to do." He passed out of the room. Perrichet stood aside, his face crimson, his attitude one of shame. He had been rebuked by the great Monsieur Hanaud, and justly rebuked. He knew it now. He had wished to display his intelligence. Yes, at all costs he must show how intelligent he was. And he had shown himself a fool. He should have kept silence about that pot of cream. End of chapter 7. At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. The Captain of the Ship. Hanaud walked away from the Villa Rose in the company of Wethermill and Ricardo. "We will go in and lunch," he said. "Yes, come to my hotel," said Harry Wethermill. But Hanaud shook his head. "No, come with me to the Villa des Fleurs," he replied. "We may learn something there, and in a case like this every minute is of importance. We have to be quick." "I may come too?" cried Mr. Ricardo eagerly. "By all means," replied Hanaud with a smile of extreme courtesy. Nothing could be more delicious than Monsieur's suggestions, and with that remark he walked on silently. Mr. Ricardo was in a little doubt as to the exact significance of the words, but he was too excited to dwell long upon them. Distressed though he sought to be at his friend's grief, he could not but assume an air of importance. All the artist in him rose joyfully to the occasion. He looked upon himself from the outside. He fancied, without the slightest justification, that people were pointing him out. "That man has been present at the investigation at the Villa Rose," he seemed to hear people say. "What strange things he could tell us if he would." And suddenly Mr. Ricardo began to reflect. What, after all, could he have told them? And that question he turned over in his mind while he ate his luncheon. Hanaud wrote a letter between the courses. They were sitting at a corner table, and Hanaud was in the corner with his back to the wall. He moved his plate, too, over the letter as he wrote it. It would have been impossible for either of his guests to see what he had written, even if they had wished. Ricardo indeed did wish. He rather resented the secrecy with which the detective, under a show of openness, shrouded his thoughts and acts. Hanaud sent the waiter out to fetch an officer in plain clothes who was in attendance at the door, and he handed the letter to this man. Then he turned with an apology to his guests. "It is necessary that we should find out," he explained, "as soon as possible, the whole record of Mademoiselle Celie." He lighted a cigar, and over the coffee he put a question to Ricardo. "Now tell me what you make of the case. What Monsieur Wethermill thinks, that is clear, is it not? Helene Vauquier is the guilty one. But you, Monsieur Ricardo, what is your opinion?" Ricardo took from his pocket-book a sheet of paper, and from his pocket a pencil. He was intensely flattered by the request of Hanaud, and he proposed to do himself justice. "I will make a note here of what I think the salient features of the mystery," and he proceeded to tabulate the points in the following way. 1. Celia Harland made her entrance into Madame Dauvray's household under very doubtful circumstances. 2. By methods still more doubtful, she acquired an extraordinary ascendancy over Madame Dauvray's mind. 3. If proof were needed how complete that ascendancy was, a glance at Celia Harland's wardrobe would suffice, for she wore the most expensive clothes. 4. It was Celia Harland who arranged that Servettaz, the chauffeur, should be absent at Chambéry on the Tuesday night, the night of the murder. 5. It was Celia Harland who bought the cord with which Madame Dauvray was strangled and Helene Vauquier bound. 6. The footsteps outside the salon showed that Celia Harland ran from the salon to the motor car. 7. Celia Harland pretended that there should be a séance on the Tuesday, but she dressed as though she had in view an appointment with a lover instead of a spiritualistic stance. 8. Celia Harland has disappeared. These 8 points are strongly suggestive of Celia Harland's complicity in the murder, but I have no clue which will enable me to answer the following questions. A. Who was the man who took part in the crime? B. Who was the woman who came to the villa on the evening of the murder with Madame Dauvray and Celia Harland? C. What actually happened in the salon? How was the murder committed? D. Is Helene Vauquier's story true? E. What did the torn-up scrap of writing mean? Probably spirit writing in Celia Harland's hand. F. Why has one cushion on the settee a small fresh brown stain, which is probably blood? Why is the other cushion torn? Mr. Ricardo had a momentary thought of putting down yet another question. He was inclined to ask whether or no a pot of cold cream had disappeared from Celia Harland's bedroom, but he remembered that Hanaud had set no store upon that incident, and he refrained. Moreover, he had come to the end of his sheet of paper. He handed it across the table to Hanaud and leaned back in his chair, watching the detective with all the eagerness of a young author submitting his first effort to a critic. Hanaud read it through slowly. At the end he nodded his head in approval. "Now we will see what Mr. Wethermill has to say," he said, and he stretched out the paper towards Harry Wethermill, who throughout the luncheon had not said a word. "No, no!" cried Ricardo. But Harry Wethermill already held the written sheet in his hand. He smiled rather wistfully at his friend. "It is best that I should know just what you both think," he said. and in his turn he began to read the paper through. He read the first 8 points and then beat with his fist upon the table. "No, no," he cried. "It is not possible. I don't blame you, Ricardo. These are facts, and as I said, I can face facts. But there will be an explanation if only we can discover it." He buried his face for a moment in his hands. Then he took up the paper again. "As for the rest, Helene Vauquier lied," he cried violently, and he tossed the paper to Hanaud. "What do you make of it?" Hanaud smiled and shook his head. "Did you ever go for a voyage on a ship?" he asked. "Yes. Why?" "Because every day at noon 3 officers take an observation to determine the ship's position. The captain, the first officer, and the second officer. Each writes his observation down, and the captain takes the 3 observations and compares them. If the first or second officer is out on his reckoning, the captain tells him so, but he does not show his own. For at times, no doubt, he is wrong too. So, gentlemen, I criticize your observations, but I do not show you mine." He took up Ricardo's paper and read it through again. "Yes," he said pleasantly, "but the 2 questions which are most important, which alone can lead us to the truth, how do they come to be omitted from your list, Mr. Ricardo?" Hanaud put the question with his most serious air, but Ricardo was none the less sensible of the raillery behind the solemn manner. He flushed and made no answer. "Still," continued Hanaud, "here are undoubtedly some questions. Let us consider them. Who was the man who took a part in the crime? Ah, if we only knew that, what a lot of trouble we should save ourselves. Who was the woman? What a good thing it would be to know that too. How clearly, after all, Mr. Ricardo puts his finger on the important points. What did actually happen in the salon?" And as he quoted that question, the raillery died out of his voice. He leaned his elbows on the table and bent forward. "What did actually happen in that little pretty room just 12 hours ago?" he repeated. "When no sunlight blazed upon the lawn, and all the birds were still, and all the windows shuttered, and the world dark? What happened? What dreadful things happened? We have not much to go upon. Let us formulate what we know. We start with this. The murder was not the work of a moment. It was planned with great care and cunning, and carried out to the letter of the plan. There must be no noise, no violence. On each side of the Villa Rose there are other villas. A few yards away the road runs past. A scream, a cry, the noise of a struggle, these sounds, or any one of them, might be fatal to success. Thus the crime was planned, and there was no scream, there was no struggle. Not a chair was broken, and only a chair upset. Yes, there were brains behind that murder, we know that. But what do we know of the plan? How far can we build it up? Let us see. First, there was an accomplice in the house, perhaps 2. "No!" cried Harry Wethermill. Hanaud took no notice of the interruption. "Secondly, the woman came to the house with Madame Dauvray and Mademoiselle Celie between 9 and 9:30. Thirdly, the man came afterwards, but before 11, set open the gate and was admitted into the salon, unperceived by Madame Dauvray. That also we can safely assume. But what happened in the salon? Ah, there is the question." Then he shrugged his shoulders and said with a note of raillery once more in his voice, "But why should we trouble our heads to puzzle out this mystery, since Monsieur Ricardo knows?" "I?" cried Ricardo in amazement. "To be sure," replied Hanaud calmly, "for I look at another of your questions. What did the torn-up scrap of writing mean? And you add, probably spirit writing. Then there was a séance held last night in the little salon. Is that so?" Harry Wethermill started. Mr. Ricardo was at a loss. "I had not followed my suggestion to its conclusion," he admitted humbly. "No," said Hanaud. "But I ask myself in sober earnest, was there a séance held in the salon last night? Did the tambourine rattle in the darkness on the wall?" "But if Helene Vauquier's story is all untrue," cried Wethermill, again in exasperation. "Patience, my friend. Her story was not all untrue. I say there were brains behind this crime. Yes, but brains, even the cleverest, would not have invented this queer, strange story of the séances and of Madame de Montespan. That is truth. But yet, if there were a séance held, if the scrap of paper were spirit writing in answer to some awkward question, why, and here I come to my first question, which Monsieur Ricardo has omitted, why did Mademoiselle Celie dress herself with so much elegance last night? What Vauquier said is true. Her dress was not suited to a séance. A light-coloured, rustling frock, which would be visible in a dim light or even in the dark, which would certainly be heard at every movement she made, however lightly she stepped, and a big hat. No, no. I tell you, gentlemen, we shall not get to the bottom of this mystery until we know why Mademoiselle Celie dressed herself as she did last night. Yes, Ricardo admitted. I overlooked that point. Did she? Hanaud broke off and bowed to Wethermill with a grace and a respect which condoned his words. You must bear with me, my young friend, while I consider all these points. Did she expect to join that night a lover, a man with the brains to devise this crime? But if so, and here I come to the second question omitted from Monsieur Ricardo's list, why, on the patch of grass outside the door of the salon, were the footsteps of the man and woman so carefully erased, and the footsteps of Mademoiselle Celie, those little footsteps so easily identified, left for all the world to see and recognize? Ricardo felt like a child in the presence of his schoolmaster. He was convicted of presumption. He had set down his questions with the belief that they covered the ground, and here were two of the utmost importance, not forgotten, but never even thought of. Did she go, before the murder, to join a lover, or after it? At some time, you will remember, according to Vauquier's story, she must have run upstairs to fetch her coat. Was the murder committed during the interval when she was upstairs? Was the salon dark when she came down again? Did she run through it quickly, eagerly, noticing nothing amiss? And indeed, how should she notice anything if the salon were dark, and Madame Dauvray's body lay under the windows at the side? Ricardo leaned forward eagerly. "That must be the truth," he cried, and Wethermill's voice broke hastily in. "It is not the truth, and I will tell you why. Celia Harland was to have married me this week." There was so much pain and misery in his voice that Ricardo was moved as he had seldom been. Wethermill buried his face in his hands. Hanaud shook his head and gazed across the table at Ricardo with an expression which the latter was at no loss to understand. Lovers were impracticable people, but he, Hanaud, he knew the world. Women had fooled men before today. Wethermill snatched his hands away from before his face. "We talk theories," he cried desperately, "of what may have happened at the villa. But we are not by 1 inch nearer to the man and woman who committed the crime. It is for them we have to search." "Yes, but except by asking ourselves questions, how shall we find them, Monsieur Wethermill?" said Hanaud. "Take the man. We know nothing of him. He has left no trace. Look at this town of Aix, where people come and go like a crowd about the baccarat table. He may be at Marseille today. He may be in this very room where we are taking our luncheon. How shall we find him?" Wethermill nodded his head in a despairing assent. "I know, but it is so hard to sit still and do nothing," he cried. "Yes, but we are not sitting still," said Hanaud, and Wethermill looked up with a sudden interest. "All the time that we have been lunching here, the intelligent Perrichet has been making inquiries. Madame Dauvray and Mademoiselle Celie left the Villa Rose at 5 and returned on foot soon after 9 with the strange woman. And there I see Perrichet himself waiting to be summoned." Hanaud beckoned towards the sergent de ville. "Perrichet will make an excellent detective," he said, "for he looks more bovine and foolish in plain clothes than he does in uniform." Perrichet advanced in his mufti to the table. "Speak, my friend," said Hanaud. "I went to the shop of Monsieur Corval. Mademoiselle Celie was quite alone when she bought the cord. But a few minutes later, in the Rue du Casino, she and Madame Dauvray were seen together, walking slowly in the direction of the villa. No other woman was with them." "That is a pity," said Hanaud quietly, and with a gesture he dismissed Perrichet. "You see, we shall find out nothing, nothing," said Wethermill with a groan. "We must not yet lose heart, for we know a little more about the woman than we do about the man," said Hanaud consolingly. "True," exclaimed Ricardo. "We have Helene Vauquier's description of her. We must advertise it." Hanaud smiled. "But that is a fine suggestion," he cried. "We must think over that," and he clapped his hand to his forehead with a gesture of self-reproach. "Why did not such a fine idea occur to me, fool that I am? However, we will call the head waiter." The head waiter was sent for and appeared before them. "You knew Madame Dauvray?" Hanaud asked. "Yes, monsieur. Oh, the poor woman!" And he flung up his hands. "And you knew her young companion?" "Oh, yes, monsieur. They generally had their meals here. See, at that little table over there. I kept it for them. But monsieur knows well," and the waiter looked towards Harry Wethermill, "for monsieur was often with them." "Yes," said Hanaud. "Did Madame Dauvray dine at that little table last night?" "No, monsieur. She was not here last night." "Nor Mademoiselle Celie?" "No, monsieur. I do not think they were in the Villa des Fleurs at all." "We know they were not," exclaimed Ricardo. "Wethermill and I were in the rooms and we did not see them." "But perhaps you left early," objected Hanaud. "No," said Ricardo. "It was just 10 o'clock when we reached the Majestic." "You reached your hotel at 10," Hanaud repeated. "Did you walk straight from here?" "Yes." "Then you left here about 10:15, and we know that Madame Dauvray was back at the villa soon after 9. Yes, they could not have been here last night," Hanaud agreed, and sat for a moment silent. Then he turned to the head waiter. "Have you noticed any woman with Madame Dauvray and her companion lately?" "No, monsieur, I do not think so." "Think. A woman, for instance, with red hair." Harry Wethermill started forward. Mr. Ricardo stared at Hanaud in amazement. The waiter reflected. "No, monsieur, I have seen no woman with red hair." "Thank you," said Hanaud, and the waiter moved away. "A woman with red hair!" cried Wethermill. "But Helene Vauquier described her. She was sallow, her eyes, her hair were dark." Hanaud turned with a smile to Harry Wethermill. "Did Helene Vauquier, then, speak the truth?" he asked. "No, the woman who was in the salon last night, who returned home with Madame Dauvray and Mademoiselle Celie, was not a woman with black hair and bright black eyes. Look!" And fetching his pocket-book from his pocket, he unfolded a sheet of paper and showed them, lying upon its white surface, a long red hair. "I picked that up on the table, the round satinwood table in the salon. It was not easy to see it, but I did see it. Now, that is not Mademoiselle Celie's hair, which is fair, nor Madame Dauvray's, which is dyed brown, nor Helene Vauquier's, which is black, nor the charwoman's, which, as I have taken the trouble to find out, is grey. It is therefore from the head of our unknown woman. And I will tell you more. This woman with the red hair, she is in Geneva." A startled exclamation burst from Ricardo. Harry Wethermill sat slowly down. For the first time that day there had come some colour into his cheeks, a sparkle into his eye. "But that is wonderful!" he cried. "How did you find that out?" Hanaud leaned back in his chair and took a pull at his cigar. He was obviously pleased with Wethermill's admiration. "Yes, how did you find it out?" Ricardo repeated. Hanaud smiled. "As to that," he said, "remember, I am the captain of the ship, and I do not show you my observation." Ricardo was disappointed. Harry Wethermill, however, started to his feet. "We must search Geneva, then," he cried. "It is there we should be, not here drinking our coffee at the Villa des Fleurs." Hanaud raised his hand. "The search is not being overlooked. But Geneva is a big city. It is not easy to search Geneva and find, when we know nothing about the woman for whom we are searching, except that her hair is red, and that probably a young girl last night was with her. It is rather here, I think, in Aix, that we must keep our eyes wide open." "Here!" cried Wethermill in exasperation. He stared at Hanaud as though he were mad. "Yes, here, at the post office, at the telephone exchange. Suppose that the man is in Aix, as he may well be, Sometime he will wish to send a letter, or a telegram, or a message over the telephone. That, I tell you, is our chance. But here is news for us." Hanaud pointed to a messenger who was walking towards them. The man handed Hanaud an envelope. "For Monsieur le Commissaire," he said, and he saluted and retired. "For Monsieur le Commissaire?" cried Ricardo excitedly. But before Hanaud could open the envelope, Harry Wethermill laid a hand upon his sleeve. "Before we pass to something new, Monsieur Hanaud," he said, "I should be very glad if you would tell me what made you shiver in the salon this morning. It has distressed me ever since. What was it that those two cushions had to tell you?" There was a note of anguish in his voice, difficult to resist. But Hanaud resisted it. He shook his head. "Again," he said gravely, "I am to remind you that I am the captain of the ship, and do not show my observation." He tore open the envelope and sprang up from his seat. "Madame Dauvray's motor car has been found," he cried. "Let us go." Hanaud called for the bill and paid it. The three men left the Villa des Fleurs together. End of chapter 8. Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Madame Dauvray's motor car. They got into a cab outside the door. Perrichet mounted the box, and the cab was driven along the upward winding road past the Hôtel Bernascon. 100 yards beyond the hotel, the cab stopped opposite to a villa. A hedge separated the garden of the villa from the road, and above the hedge rose a board with the words "To Let" upon it. At the gate a gendarme was standing, and just within the gate Ricardo saw Louis Besnard, the commissaire, and Servettaz, Madame Dauvray's chauffeur. "It is here," said Besnard, as the party descended from the cab, "in the coach-house of this empty villa." "Here?" cried Ricardo in amazement. The discovery upset all his theories. He had expected to hear that it had been found 50 leagues away. But here, within a couple of miles of the Villa Rose itself, the idea seemed absurd. Why take it away at all, unless it was taken away as a blind? That supposition found its way into Ricardo's mind and gathered strength as he thought upon it. For Hanaud had seemed to lean to the belief that one of the murderers might still be an X. Indeed, a glance at him showed that he was not discomposed by their discovery. "When was it found?" Hanaud asked. "This morning. A gardener comes to the villa on 2 days a week to keep the grounds in order. Fortunately, Wednesday is one of his days. Fortunately, too, there was rain yesterday evening. He noticed the tracks of the wheels which you see on the gravel, and since the villa is empty he was surprised. He found the coach-house door forced and the motor car inside it. When he went to his luncheon he brought the news of his discovery to the depot." The party followed the commissaire along the drive to the coach-house. "We will have the car brought out," said Hanaud to Servettaz. It was a big and powerful machine, with a limousine body, luxuriously fitted and cushioned in the shade of light grey. The outside panels of the car were painted a dark grey. The car had hardly been brought out into the sunlight before a cry of stupefaction burst from the lips of Perrichet. "Oh," he cried, in utter abasement, "I shall never forgive myself, never, never." "Why?" Hanaud asked, turning sharply as he spoke. Perrichet was standing with his round eyes staring and his mouth agape. "Because, monsieur, I saw that car, at 4 o'clock this morning, at the corner of the road, not 50 yards from the Villa Rose." "What?" cried Ricardo. "You saw it?" exclaimed Wethermill. Upon their faces was reflected now the stupefaction of Perrichet. "But you must have made a mistake," said the commissaire. "No, no, monsieur," Perrichet insisted. "It was that car, it was that number, it was just after daylight. I was standing outside the gate of the villa on duty where Monsieur le Commissaire had placed me. The car appeared at the corner and slackened speed. It seemed to me that it was going to turn into the road and come down past me. But instead, the driver, as if he were now sure of his way, put the car at its top speed and went into X." "Was anyone inside the car?" asked Hanaud. "No, monsieur, it was empty." "But you saw the driver?" exclaimed Wethermill. Yes, what was he like? Cried the commissaire. Perrichet shook his head mournfully. He wore a talc mask over the upper part of his face, and had a little black moustache, and was dressed in a heavy great-coat of blue with a white collar. "That is my coat, monsieur," said Servettaz, and as he spoke he lifted it up from the chauffeur's seat. "It is Madame Dauvray's livery." Harry Wethermill groaned aloud. "We have lost him. He was within our grasp, he the murderer, and he was allowed to go." Perrichet's grief was pitiable. "Monsieur," he pleaded, "a car slackens its speed and goes on again. It is not so unusual a thing. I do not know the number of Madame Dauvray's car. I did not even know that it had disappeared." And suddenly tears of mortification filled his eyes. "But why do I make these excuses?" he cried. "It is better, Monsieur Hanaud, that I go back to my uniform and stand at the street corner. I am as foolish as I look." "Nonsense, my friend," said Hanaud, clapping the disconsolate man upon the shoulder. "You remembered the car and its number. That is something, and perhaps a great deal," he added gravely. "As for the talc mask and the black moustache, that is not much to help us, it is true." He looked at Ricardo's crestfallen face and smiled. "We might arrest our good friend Monsieur Ricardo upon that evidence, but no one else that I know." Hanaud laughed immoderately at his joke. He alone seemed to feel no disappointment at Perrichet's oversight. Ricardo was a little touchy on the subject of his personal appearance, and bridled visibly. Hanaud turned towards Servettaz. "Now," he said, "you know how much petrol was taken from the garage?" "Yes, monsieur." "Can you tell me, by the amount which has been used, how far that car was driven last night?" Hanaud asked. Servettaz examined the tank. "A long way, monsieur. From 130 to 150 kilometres, I should say." "Yes, just about that distance, I should say," cried Hanaud. His eyes brightened, and a smile, a rather fierce smile, came to his lips. He opened the door and examined with a minute scrutiny the floor of the carriage, and as he looked the smile faded from his face. Perplexity returned to it. He took the cushions, looked them over, and shook them out. "I see no sign," he began, and then he uttered a little shrill cry of satisfaction. From the crack of the door by the hinge he picked off a tiny piece of pale green stuff, which he spread out upon the back of his hand. "Tell me, what is this?" he said to Ricardo. "It is a green fabric," said Ricardo very wisely. "It is green chiffon," said Hanaud, "and the frock in which Mademoiselle Celie went away was of green chiffon over satin. Yes, Mademoiselle Celie travelled in this car." He hurried to the driver's seat. Upon the floor there was some dark mould. Hanaud cleaned it off with his knife and held some of it in the palm of his hand. He turned to Servettaz. "You drove the car on Tuesday morning before you went to Chambéry?" "Yes, monsieur." "Where did you take up Madame Dauvray and Mademoiselle Celie?" "At the front door of the Villa Rose." "Did you get down from the seat at all?" "No, monsieur, not after I left the garage." Hanaud returned to his companions. "See," and he opened his hand. "This is black soil, moist from last night's rain. Soil like the soil in front of Madame Dauvray's salon. Look, here is even a blade or two of the grass." And he turned the mould over in the palm of his hand. Then he took an empty envelope from his pocket and poured the soil into it and gummed the flap down. He stood and frowned at the motor car. "Listen," he said, "how I am puzzled. There was a man last night at the Villa Rose. There were a man's blurred footmarks in the mould before the glass door. That man drove Madame's car for 150 kilometres, and he leaves the mould which clung to his boots upon the floor of his seat. Mademoiselle Celie and another woman drove away inside the car. Mademoiselle Celie leaves a fragment of the chiffon tunic of her frock, which caught in the hinge. But Mademoiselle Celie made much clearer impressions in the mould than the man. Yet on the floor of the carriage there is no trace of her shoes. Again, I say there is something here which I do not understand." And he spread out his hands with an impulsive gesture of despair. "It looks as if they had been careful and he careless," said Mr. Ricardo, with the air of a man solving a very difficult problem. "What a mind!" cried Hanaud, now clasping his hands together in admiration. "How quick and how profound!" There was at times something elephantinely elfish in Monsieur Hanaud's demeanour, which left Mr. Ricardo at a loss. But he had come to notice that these undignified manifestations usually took place when Hanaud had reached a definite opinion upon some point which had perplexed him. "Yet there is perhaps another explanation," Hanaud continued. "For, observe, Monsieur Ricardo, we have other evidence to show that the careless one was Mademoiselle Celie. It was she who left her footsteps so plainly visible upon the grass, not the man. However, we will go back to Monsieur Wethermill's room at the Hotel Majestic and talk this matter over. We know something now. Yes, we know. What do we know, monsieur?" he asked, suddenly turning with a smile to Ricardo. And as Ricardo paused, "Think it over while we walk down to Monsieur Wethermill's apartment in the Hotel Majestic." "We know that the murderer has escaped," replied Ricardo hotly. "The murderer is not now the most important object of our search. He is very likely at Marseille by now. We shall lay our hands on him, never fear," replied Hanaud, with a superb gesture of disdain. "But it was thoughtful of you to remind me of him. I might so easily have clean forgotten him, and then indeed my reputation would have suffered an eclipse." He made a low, ironical bow to Ricardo and walked quickly down the road. "For a cumbersome man he is extraordinarily active," said Mr. Ricardo to Harry Wethermill, trying to laugh without much success. A heavy, clever, middle-aged man, liable to become a little gutter boy at a moment's notice. Thus he described the great detective, and the description is quoted, for it was Ricardo's best effort in the whole of this business. The three men went straight to Harry Wethermill's apartment, which consisted of a sitting-room and a bedroom on the first floor. A balcony ran along outside. Hanaud stepped out onto it, looked around him, and returned. "It is as well to know that we cannot be overheard," he said. Harry Wethermill meanwhile had thrown himself into a chair. The mask he had worn had slipped from its fastenings for a moment. There was a look of infinite suffering upon his face. It was the face of a man tortured by misery to the snapping point. Hanaud, on the other hand, was particularly alert. The discovery of the motor car had raised his spirits. He sat at the table. "I will tell you what we have learnt," he said, "and it is of importance. The three of them, the man, the woman with the red hair, and Mademoiselle Celie, all drove yesterday night to Geneva. That is only one thing we have learnt." "Then you still cling to Geneva?" said Ricardo. "More than ever," said Hanaud. He turned in his chair towards Wethermill. "Ah, my poor friend," he said, when he saw the young man's distress. Harry Wethermill sprang up with a gesture as though to sweep the need of sympathy away. "What can I do for you?" he asked. "You have a road map, perhaps?" said Hanaud. "Yes," said Wethermill, "mine is here. There it is." And crossing the room he brought it from a side table and placed it in front of Hanaud. Hanaud took a pencil from his pocket. 150 kilometres was about the distance which the car had travelled. Measure the distances here, and you will see that Geneva is the likely place. It is a good city to hide in. Moreover, the car appears at the corner at daylight. How does it appear there? What road is it which comes out at that corner? The road from Geneva. I am not sorry that it is Geneva, for the chef de la sûreté is a friend of mine." "And what else do we know?" asked Ricardo. "This," said Hanaud. He paused impressively. "Bring up your chair to the table, Monsieur Wethermill, and consider whether I am right or wrong." And he waited until Harry Wethermill had obeyed. Then he laughed in a friendly way at himself. "I cannot help it," he said. "I have an eye for dramatic effects. I must prepare for them when I know they are coming, and one, I tell you, is coming now." He shook his finger at his companions. Ricardo shifted and shuffled in his chair. Harry Wethermill kept his eyes fixed on Hanaud's face, but he was quiet as he had been throughout the long inquiry. Hanaud lit his cigarette and took his time. "What I think is this. The man who drove the car into Geneva drove it back because he meant to leave it again in the garage of the Villa Rose." "Good heavens!" cried Ricardo, flinging himself back. The theory so calmly enunciated took his breath away. "Would he have dared?" asked Harry Wethermill. Hanaud leaned across and tapped his fingers on the table to emphasize his answer. All through this crime there are two things visible, brains and daring, clever brains and extraordinary daring. Would he have dared? He dared to be at the corner close to Villa Rose at daylight. Why else should he have returned except to put back the car? Consider. The petrol is taken from tins, which Servettaz might never have touched for a fortnight, and by that time he might, as he said, have forgotten whether he had not used them himself. I had this possibility in my mind when I put the questions to Servettaz about the petrol, which the commissaire thought so stupid. The utmost care is taken that there shall be no mould left on the floor of the carriage. The scrap of chiffon was torn off, no doubt, when the women finally left the car, and therefore not noticed, or that too would have been removed. That the exterior of the car was dirty betrayed nothing, for Servettaz had left it uncleaned. Hanaud leaned back and step by step related the journey of the car. The man leaves the gate open. He drives into Geneva the two women, who are careful that their shoes shall leave no marks upon the floor. At Geneva they get out. The man returns. If he can only leave the car in the garage, he covers all traces of the course he and his friends have taken. No one would suspect that the car had ever left the garage. At the corner of the road, just as he is turning down the villa, he sees the sergent de ville at the gate. He knows that the murder is discovered. He puts on full speed and goes straight out of the town. What is he to do? He is driving a car for which the police, in an hour or two, if not now already, will surely be watching. He is driving in broad daylight. He must get rid of it, and at once, before people are about to see it, and to see him in it. Imagine his feelings. It is almost enough to make one pity him. Here he is in a car which convicts him as a murderer, and he has nowhere to leave it. He drives through Aix. Then on the outskirts of the town he finds an empty villa. He drives in at the gate, forces the door of the coach-house, and leaves his car there. Now, observe. It is no longer any use for him to pretend that he and his friends did not disappear in that car. The murder is already discovered, and with the murder the disappearance of the car. So he no longer troubles his head about it. He does not remove the traces of mould from the place where his feet rested, which otherwise no doubt he would have done. It no longer matters. He has to run to earth now before he is seen. That is all his business. And so the state of the car is explained. It was a bold step to bring that car back. Yes, a bold and desperate step, but a clever one. For if it had succeeded, we should have known nothing of their movements. Oh, but nothing, nothing. Ah, I tell you, this is no ordinary blundering affair. They are clever people who devised this crime. Clever and of an audacity which is surprising. Then Hanaud lit another cigarette. Mr. Ricardo, on the other hand, could hardly continue to smoke for excitement. "I cannot understand your calmness," he exclaimed. "No," said Hanaud, "yet it is so obvious. You are the amateur. I am the professional. That is all." He looked at his watch and rose to his feet. "I must go," he said, and as he turned towards the door, a cry sprang from Mr. Ricardo's lips. "It is true, I am the amateur, yet I have knowledge, Monsieur Hanaud, which the professional would do well to obtain." Hanaud turned a guarded face towards Ricardo. There was no longer any raillery in his manner. He spoke slowly, coldly. "Let me have it, then." "I have driven in my motor car from Geneva to Aix," Ricardo cried excitedly. "A bridge crosses a ravine high up amongst the mountains. At the bridge there is a custom house. There, at the Pont de la Caille, your car is stopped. It is searched. You must sign your name in a book. And there is no way round. You would find sure and certain proof whether or no Madame Dauvray's car travelled last night to Geneva. Not so many travellers pass along that road at night. You would find certain proof, too, of how many people were in the car, for they search carefully at the Pont de la Caille." A dark flush overspread Hanaud's face. Ricardo was in the seventh heaven. He had at last contributed something to the history of this crime. He had repaired an omission. He had supplied knowledge to the omniscient. Wethermill looked up drearily, like one who has lost heart. "Yes, you must not neglect that clue," he said. Hanaud replied testily. "It is not a clue. Monsieur Ricardo tells that he travelled from Geneva into France and that his car was searched. Well, we know already that the officers are particular at the customs houses of France. But travelling from France into Switzerland is a very different affair. In Switzerland, hardly a glance, hardly a word. That was true. Monsieur Ricardo, crestfallen, recognized the truth. But his spirits rose again at once. "But the car came back from Geneva into France," he cried. "Yes, but when the car came back, the man was alone in it," Hanaud answered. "I have more important things to attend to. For instance, I must know whether by any chance they have caught our man at Marseilles." He laid his hand on Wethermill's shoulder. "And you, my friend, I should counsel you to get some sleep. We may need all our strength tomorrow. I hope so." He was speaking very bravely. "Yes, I hope so." Wethermill nodded. "I shall try," he said. "That's better," said Hanaud cheerfully. "You will both stay here this evening, for if I have news I can then ring you up." Both men agreed, and Hanaud went away. He left Mr. Ricardo profoundly disturbed. "That man will take advice from no one," he declared. "His vanity is colossal. It is true they are not particular at the Swiss frontier. Still, the car would have to stop there. At the custom house they would know something. Hanaud ought to make inquiries." But neither Ricardo nor Harry Wethermill heard a word more from Hanaud that night. End of chapter 9. Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. News from Geneva. The next morning, however, before Mr. Ricardo was out of his bed, Monsieur Hanaud was announced. He came stepping gaily into the room, more elephantinely elfish than ever. "Send your valet away," he said, and as soon as they were alone he produced a newspaper, which he flourished in Mr. Ricardo's face and then dropped into his hands. Ricardo saw staring him in the face a full description of Celia Harland, of her appearance and her dress, of everything except her name, coupled with an intimation that a reward of 4,000 francs would be paid to anyone who could give information leading to the discovery of her whereabouts to Mr. Ricardo, the Hotel Majestic, Aix-les-Bains. Mr. Ricardo sat up in his bed with a sense of outrage. "You have done this?" he asked. "Yes." "Why have you done it?" Mr. Ricardo cried. Hanaud advanced to the bed mysteriously, on the tips of his toes. "I will tell you," he said in his most confidential tones, "only it must remain a secret between you and me. I did it because I have a sense of humour." "I hate publicity," said Mr. Ricardo acidly. "On the other hand, you have 4,000 francs," protested the detective. "Besides, what else should I do? If I name myself, the very people we are seeking to catch, who, you may be sure, will be the first to read this advertisement, will know that I, the great, the incomparable Hanaud, am after them, and I do not want them to know that. Besides," and he spoke now in a gentle and most serious voice, "why should we make life more difficult for Mademoiselle Celie by telling the world that the police want her? It will be time enough for that when she appears before the juge d'instruction." Mr. Ricardo grumbled inarticulately and read through the advertisement again. "Besides, your description is incomplete," he said. "There is no mention of the diamond earrings which Celia Harland was wearing when she ran away." "Ah, so you noticed that?" exclaimed Hanaud. "A little more experience, and I should be looking very closely to my laurels. But as for the earrings, I will tell you, Mademoiselle Celie was not wearing them when she went away from the Villa Rose." But, stammered Ricardo, "the case upon the dressing-room table was empty." "Still, she was not wearing them. I know," said Hanaud decisively. "How do you know?" cried Ricardo, gazing at Hanaud with awe in his eyes. "How could you know?" "Because," and Hanaud struck a majestic attitude, like a king in a play, "because I am the captain of the ship." Upon that Mr. Ricardo suffered a return of his ill humour. "I do not like to be trifled with," he remarked, with as much dignity as his ruffled hair and the bedclothes allowed him. He looked sternly at the newspaper, turning it over, and then he uttered a cry of surprise. "But this is yesterday's paper," he said. "Yesterday evening's paper," Hanaud corrected. "Printed at Geneva." "Printed and published and sold at Geneva," said Hanaud. "When did you send the advertisement in, then?" "I wrote a letter while we were taking our luncheon," Hanaud explained. "The letter was to Besnard, asking him to telegraph the advertisement at once." "But you never said a word about it to us," Ricardo grumbled. "No, and was I not wise?" said Hanaud with complacency. "For you would have forbidden me to use your name." "Oh, I don't go so far as that," said Ricardo reluctantly. His indignation was rapidly evaporating, for there was growing up in his mind a pleasant perception that the advertisement placed him in the limelight. He rose from his bed. "You will make yourself comfortable in the sitting-room while I have my bath." "I will indeed," replied Hanaud cheerily. "I have already ordered my morning chocolate. I have hopes that you may have a telegram very soon. This paper was cried last night through the streets of Geneva." Ricardo dressed for once in a way with some approach to ordinary celerity, and joined Hanaud. "Has nothing come?" he asked. "No. This chocolate is very good. It is better than that which I get in my hotel." "Good heavens!" cried Ricardo, who was fairly twittering with excitement. "You sit there talking about chocolate while my cup shakes in my fingers." "Again I must remind you that you are the amateur, I the professional, my friend." As the morning drew on, however, Hanaud's professional quietude deserted him. He began to start at the sound of footsteps in the corridor, to glance every other moment from the window, to eat his cigarettes rather than to smoke them. At 11 o'clock Ricardo's valet brought a telegram into the room. Ricardo seized it. "Calmly, my friend," said Hanaud. With trembling fingers Ricardo tore it open. He jumped in his chair. Speechless, he handed the telegram to Hanaud. It had been sent from Geneva, and it ran thus: "Expect me soon after 3, Marthe Gobin." Hanaud nodded his head. "I told you I had hopes." All his levity had gone in an instant from his manner. He spoke very quietly. "I had better send for Wethermill?" asked Ricardo. Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. "As you like. But why raise hopes in that poor man's breast, which an hour or two may dash for ever to the ground? Consider, Marthe Gobin has something to tell us. Think over those 8 points of evidence which you drew up yesterday in the Villa des Fleurs, and say whether what she has to tell us is more likely to prove Mademoiselle Celie's innocence than her guilt. Think well, for I will be guided by you, Monsieur Ricardo," said Hanaud solemnly. "If you think it better that your friend should live in torture until Marthe Gobin comes, and then perhaps suffer worse torture from the news she brings, be it so. You shall decide. If, on the other hand, you decide it will be best to leave Monsieur Wethermill in peace until we know her story, be it so. You shall decide." Ricardo moved uneasily. The solemnity of Hanaud's manner impressed him. He had no wish to take the responsibility of the decision upon himself, but Hanaud sat with his eyes strangely fixed upon Ricardo, waiting for his answer. "Well," said Ricardo at length, "good news will be none the worse for waiting a few hours. Bad news will be a little the better." "Yes," said Hanaud, "so I thought you would decide." He took up a Continental Bradshaw from a bookshelf in the room. "From Geneva she will come through Culoz. Let us see." He turned over the pages. "There is a train from Culoz which reaches Aix at 7 minutes past 3. It is by that train she will come. You have a motor car?" "Yes." "Very well. Will you pick me up in it at 3 at my hotel? We will drive down to the station and see the arrivals by that train. It may help us to get some idea of the person with whom we have to deal. That is always an advantage. Now I will leave you, for I have much to do, but I will look in upon Monsieur Wethermill as I go down, and tell him that there is as yet no news." He took up his hat and stick and stood for a moment staring out the window. Then he roused himself from his reverie with a start. "You look out upon Mont Revard, I see. I think Monsieur Wethermill's view over the garden and the town is the better one," he said, and went out of his room. At 3 o'clock Ricardo called in his car, which was an open car of high power, at Hanaud's hotel, and the two men went to the station. They waited outside the exit while the passengers gave up their tickets. Amongst them a middle-aged, short woman of a plethoric tendency attracted their notice. She was neatly but shabbily dressed in black. Her gloves were darned, and she was obviously in a hurry. As she came out, she asked a commissionaire, "How far is it to the Hotel Majestic?" The man told her the hotel was at the very top of the town, and the way was steep. "But Madame can go up in the omnibus of the hotel," he suggested. Madame, however, was in too much of a hurry. The omnibus would have to wait for luggage. She hailed a closed cab and drove off inside it. "Now, if we go back in the car, we shall be all ready for her when she arrives," said Hanaud. They passed the cab, indeed, a few yards up the steep hill which leads from the station. The cab was moving at a walk. "She looks honest," said Hanaud with a sigh of relief. "She is some good bourgeoise anxious to earn 4,000 francs." They reached the hotel in a few minutes. "We may need your car again the moment Marthe Gobin has gone," said Hanaud. "It shall wait here," said Ricardo. "No," said Hanaud, "let it wait in the little street at the back of my hotel. It will not be so noticeable there. You have petrol for a long journey?" Ricardo gave the order quietly to his chauffeur, and followed Hanaud into the hotel. Through a glass window they could see Wethermill smoking a cigar over his coffee. "He looks as if he had not slept," said Ricardo. Hanaud nodded sympathetically and beckoned Ricardo past the window. "But we are nearing the end. These 2 days have been for him days of great trouble, one can see that very clearly, and he has done nothing to embarrass us. Men in distress are apt to be a nuisance. I am grateful to Monsieur Wethermill. But we are nearing the end. Who knows? Within an hour or two we may have news for him." He spoke with great feeling, and the two men ascended the stairs to Ricardo's rooms. For the second time that day Hanaud's professional calm deserted him. The window overlooked the main entrance to the hotel. Hanaud arranged the room, and even while he arranged it, ran every other second and leaned from the window to watch for the coming of the cab. "Put the bank notes upon the table," he said hurriedly. "They will persuade her to tell us all that she has to tell. Yes, that will do. She is not in sight yet?" "No." "She could not be. It is a long way from the station," said Ricardo, "and the whole distance is uphill." "Yes, that is true," Hanaud replied. "We will not embarrass her by sitting round the table like a tribunal. You will sit in that armchair." Ricardo took his seat, crossed his knees, and joined the tips of his fingers. "So, not too judicial," said Hanaud. "I will sit here at the table. Whatever you do, do not frighten her." Hanaud sat down in the chair which he had placed for himself. "Marthe Gobin shall sit opposite with the light upon her face. So." And springing up, he arranged a chair for her. "Whatever you do, do not frighten her," he repeated. "I am nervous. So much depends upon this interview." And in a second he was back at the window. Ricardo did not move. He arranged in his mind the interrogatory which was to take place. He was to conduct it. He was the master of the situation. All the limelight was to be his. Startling facts would come to light elicited by his deft questions. Hanaud need not fear. He would not frighten her. He would be gentle. He would be cunning. Softly and delicately he would turn this good woman inside out like a glove. Every artistic fibre in his body vibrated to the dramatic situation. Suddenly Hanaud leaned out of the window. "It comes, it comes," he said in a quick, feverish whisper. "I can see the cab between the shrubs of the drive." "Let it come," said Mr. Ricardo superbly. Even as he sat he could hear the grating of the wheels upon the drive. He saw Hanaud lean farther from the window and stamp impatiently upon the floor. "There it is at the door," he cried, and for a few seconds he spoke no more. He stood looking downwards, craning his head, with his back towards Ricardo. Then, with a wild and startled cry, he staggered back into the room. His face was white as wax, his eyes full of horror, his mouth open. "What is the matter?" exclaimed Ricardo, springing to his feet. "They are lifting her out. She doesn't move. They are lifting her out." For a moment he stared into Ricardo's face, paralyzed by fear. Then he sprang down the stairs. Ricardo followed him. There was confusion in the corridor. Men were running, voices were crying questions. As they passed the window they saw Wethermill start up, aroused from his lethargy. They knew the truth before they reached the entrance of the hotel. A cab had driven up to the door from the station. In the cab was an unknown woman stabbed to the heart. "She should have come by the omnibus," Hanaud repeated, and repeated stupidly. For the moment he was off his balance. End of chapter 10. Of At the Villa Rose by A.E.W. Mason. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. The Unopened Letter. The hall of the hotel had been cleared of people. At the entrance from the corridor a porter barred the way. "No one can pass," said he. "I think that I can," said Hanaud, and he produced his card. "From the Sûreté at Paris." He was allowed to enter with Ricardo at his heels. On the ground lay Marthe Gobin. The manager of the hotel stood at her side. A doctor was on his knees. Hanaud gave his card to the manager. "You have sent word to the police?" "Yes," said the manager. "And the wound?" asked Hanaud, kneeling on the ground beside the doctor. It was a very small wound, round and neat and clean, and there was very little blood. "It was made by a bullet," said Hanaud. "Some tiny bullet from an air pistol." "No," answered the doctor. "No knife made it," Hanaud asserted. "That is true," said the doctor. "Look!" And he took up from the floor by his knee the weapon which had caused Marthe Gobin's death. It was nothing but an ordinary skewer with a ring at one end and a sharp point at the other, and a piece of common white firewood for a handle. The wood had been split, the ring inserted and spliced in position with strong twine. It was a rough enough weapon, but an effective one. The proof of its effectiveness lay stretched upon the floor beside them. Hanaud gave it to the manager of the hotel. "You must be very careful of this, and give it as it is to the police." Then he bent once more over Marthe Gobin. "Did she suffer?" he asked in a low voice. "No, death must have been instantaneous," said the doctor. "I am glad of that," said Hanaud, as he rose again to his feet. In the doorway the driver of the cab was standing. "What has he to say?" Hanaud asked. The man stepped forward instantly. He was an old, red-faced, stout man, with a shiny white tall hat like 1,000 drivers of cabs. "What have I to say, monsieur?" he grumbled in a husky voice. "I take up the poor woman at the station, and I drive her where she bids me, and I find her dead, and my day is lost. Who will pay my fare, monsieur?" "I will," said Hanaud. "There it is." And he handed the man a 5-franc piece. "Now answer me. Do you tell me that this woman was murdered in your cab, and that you knew nothing about it?" "But what should I know? I take her up at the station, and all the way up the hill her head is every moment out of the window, crying, 'Faster, faster!' Oh, the good woman was in a hurry. But for me, I take no notice. The more she shouts, the less I hear. I bury my head between my shoulders, and I look ahead of me, and I take no notice. One cannot expect cab horses to run up these hills. It is not reasonable." "So you went at a walk," said Hanaud. He beckoned to Ricardo and said to the manager, "Monsieur Besnard will, no doubt, be here in a few minutes, and he will send for the juge d'instruction. There is nothing that we can do." He went back to Ricardo's sitting room and flung himself into a chair. He had been calm enough downstairs in the presence of the doctor and the body of the victim. Now, with only Ricardo for a witness, he gave way to distress. "It is terrible," he said. "The poor woman! It was I who brought her to Aix. It was through my carelessness. But who would have thought—" He snatched his hands from his face and stood up. "I should have thought," he said solemnly. "Extraordinary daring. That was one of the qualities of my criminal. I knew it and I disregarded it. Now we have a second crime." "The skewer may lead you to the criminal," said Mr. Ricardo. "The skewer!" cried Hanaud. "How will that help us? A knife, yes, perhaps. But a skewer! At the shops there will not be so many at Aix at which you can buy skewers. They may remember to whom they sold one within the last day or so." "How do we know it was bought in the last day or so?" cried Hanaud scornfully. We have not to do with a man who walks into a shop and buys a single skewer to commit a murder with, and so hands himself over to the police. How often must I say it?" The violence of his contempt nettled Ricardo. "If the murderer did not buy it, how did he obtain it?" he asked obstinately. "Oh, my friend, could he not have stolen it? From this or any hotel in Aix? Would the loss of a skewer be noticed, do you think? How many people in Aix today have had rognons à la brochette for their luncheon? Besides, it is not merely the death of this poor woman which troubles me. We have lost the evidence which she was going to bring to us. She had something to tell us about Celie Harland, which now we shall never hear. We have to begin all over again, and I tell you we have not the time to begin all over again. No, we have not the time. Time will be lost, and we have no time to lose." He buried his face again in his hands and groaned aloud. His grief was so violent and so sincere that Ricardo, shocked as he was by the murder of Marthe Gobin, set himself to console him. "But you could not have foreseen that at 3 o'clock in the afternoon at Aix—" Hanaud brushed the excuse aside. "It is no extenuation. I ought to have foreseen. Oh, but I will have no pity now," he cried, and as he ended the words abruptly his face changed. He lifted a trembling forefinger and pointed. There came a sudden look of life into his dull and despairing eyes. He was pointing to a side table on which were piled Mr. Ricardo's letters. "You have not opened them this morning?" he asked. "No, you came while I was still in bed. I have not thought of them till now." Hanaud crossed the table and, looking down at the letters, uttered a cry. "There's one, the big envelope," he said, his voice shaking like his hand. "It has a Swiss stamp." He swallowed to moisten his throat. Ricardo sprang across the room and tore open the envelope.